When a billionaire CEO pretends not to know sign language at her own charity gala, she doesn't realize the janitor cleaning her floors is about to expose the lie that's been poisoning her family for decades. This is a story about shame, silence, and the courage it takes to finally speak the truth. If you stay until the end, you'll witness a transformation that proves love isn't just spoken. Sometimes it's signed. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now let me take you inside that glittering ballroom where everything is about to change. The Grand Celestial Hotel ballroom shimmered like the inside of a jewelry box. All crystal chandeliers, gold-rimmed plates, and the kind of champagne that costs more per bottle than most people earned in a week. 500 of Manhattan's elite filled the space, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos creating a kaleidoscope of wealth and influence. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala was the charity event of the season, the kind of evening where fortunes changed hands with a handshake and business empires were built between courses. At the center of it all stood Lena Whitmore. She was impossible to miss. At 38, Lena had the kind of presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around her. Her midnight blue Valentino gown fit like it had been painted on. Her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon that exposed the diamond teardrops glittering at her ears. She moved through this crowd with the fluid confidence of someone who'd spent 2 decades building an empire from nothing, her fashion company LW Couture now valued at over $3 billion. Lena, darling, a silver-haired woman in emeralds air-kissed both her cheeks. The silent auction is absolutely inspired this year. That Basquiat piece? Divine. Margaret, you're too kind. Lena's smile was practiced, perfect, revealing nothing. I'm just grateful we're on track to raise over $10 million for children's literacy programs tonight. Your mother must be so proud, Margaret continued, glancing around. Is Eleanor here? I haven't seen her in ages. Something flickered across Lena's face, there and gone so quickly that Margaret missed it entirely. She's around somewhere. You know how these events are. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the mayor before dinner service. Lena moved away smoothly, her heels clicking against the marble floor with purpose. But she didn't head toward the mayor. Instead, she veered toward the bar, ordered a mineral water she didn't want, and positioned herself with her back deliberately turned to the far corner of the ballroom, the corner where her mother sat. Eleanor Whitmore was 72 years old, with silver hair styled in soft waves and a burgundy dress that Lena had picked out for her 3 weeks ago. She sat at table 17, not the family table near the stage, but a quiet spot near the kitchen doors where the lighting was dimmer and the floral arrangements blocked the view from most of the room. It was, Lena had told herself when making the seating arrangements, the perfect spot for someone who didn't enjoy crowds. The lie sat so comfortably in her mind that she almost believed it. Beside Eleanor sat Lena's 7-year-old triplet daughters, Sophia, Emma, and Grace. They were identical in appearance, the same honey blonde hair, the same green eyes, the same smattering of freckles across their noses, but different enough in temperament that Lena could tell them apart at a glance. Sophia, the eldest by 4 minutes, sat with perfect posture in her pale pink dress, her small hands folded in her lap. Emma, restless and curious, kept twisting in her chair to watch the jazz quartet setting up on the stage. Grace, the quietest of the three, leaned against her grandmother's arm, her thumb creeping toward her mouth before she remembered and lowered it again. "Grandma, why aren't we sitting with Mommy?" Emma asked, her voice carrying that particular pitch children achieve when they're trying to whisper but failing entirely. Eleanor Whitmore smiled at her granddaughter, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Her hands moved in response, fluid, graceful gestures that held meaning and weight. But Emma just stared at her, confusion clouding her small face. "Grandma's doing that thing with her hands again," Sophia observed, tilting her head. "Why doesn't she just talk?" "Maybe she can't?" Grace suggested quietly. "Like when you had laryngitis last year and couldn't talk for 3 whole days." "That was the worst," Emma agreed. "But that went away. Why doesn't Grandma's?" They looked at their grandmother expectantly. 3 pairs of identical eyes searching her face for answers she couldn't provide in a language they understood. Eleanor's smile wavered. Her hands moved again, slower this time, as if simplifying her gestures might somehow bridge the gap. But it was useless. The girls had never been taught sign language. Their mother had made sure of that. Eleanor glanced across the ballroom toward Lena, who stood laughing at something a senator had said, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve in a gesture of practiced charm. Their eyes met for half a second, just long enough for Eleanor to see her daughter's jaw tighten before Lena looked away, turning her full attention back to the senator as if her mother and daughters didn't exist. The ache in Eleanor's chest was familiar, worn smooth by decades of repetition. She'd felt it when Lena was 16 and refused to bring friends home. She'd felt it at Lena's wedding when her daughter had introduced her to the other guests as my mother, but never explained why Eleanor only nodded and smiled, why she never spoke. She'd felt it at the triplets' birth when Lena had hired a night nurse specifically so Eleanor wouldn't need to stay at the house to help. But knowing the pain was coming didn't make it hurt any less. "Excuse me, ladies." A server appeared beside their table, young and efficient in his pressed white shirt and black vest. "Can I get you anything to drink? We have sparkling cider for the young ladies, and for Madam." He addressed Eleanor with the kind of polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have wine, champagne, or perhaps a cocktail?" Eleanor's hands moved, signing her preference clearly. "Water, please. Just water." The server stared at her hands, his smile freezing in place. "I'm sorry, I don't—" He glanced at the triplets. "Is your grandmother feeling all right?" "She's deaf," Sophia supplied helpfully. "She talks with her hands, but we don't know what she's saying." "Ah." The server's discomfort was palpable. "Right. Well, I'll bring water for everyone then." He hurried away before anyone could respond, nearly colliding with another server carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The girls watched him go, then looked back at their grandmother, whose hands had fallen still in her lap. "Grandma looks sad," Grace whispered to her sisters. "Should we get Mommy?" Emma suggested. "Mommy's busy," Sophia said, with the world-weary tone of a child who'd heard that phrase too many times to count. "She's always busy at these things." Across the room, Lena accepted another glass of champagne she wouldn't drink and laughed at another joke she didn't find funny. But her awareness never left that corner table. She saw the server's confusion, saw her daughter's bewilderment, saw her mother's hands fall silent. She saw all of it, cataloged it with the same efficient precision she used to evaluate quarterly reports and market trends. And she did nothing. Instead, she turned to greet the CEO of a major retail chain, her smile brightening, her handshake firm and confident. "Robert, what a pleasure. I've been hoping to discuss the possibility of LW Couture opening boutiques in your flagship stores." The conversation flowed easily, naturally. This was Lena's native language, the language of business and influence, of strategic partnerships and calculated risks. Here, in this world of polished surfaces and carefully managed images, she was fluent, she was powerful. She was in control. She was safe. Back at table 17, the server returned with a tray of water glasses, setting them down quickly and retreating without making eye contact with Eleanor. The triplets reached for their glasses, their movements synchronized in that eerie way of multiples, but their attention remained fixed on their grandmother. "When I grow up," Emma announced suddenly, "I'm going to learn hand-talking so I can talk to Grandma." "It's called sign language," Sophia corrected. "Mrs. Patterson told us about it in school, remember? When we did the unit on different ways people communicate?" "Oh yeah," Emma brightened. "There was a video with a lady who talked with her hands in her face. It was really fast. I couldn't follow it at all." "Grandma doesn't talk fast," Grace observed quietly. She reached out and touched Eleanor's hand, her small fingers curling around her grandmother's. "But she smiles a lot. I like it when she smiles." Eleanor squeezed Grace's hand gently, blinking rapidly against the sudden sting in her eyes. She'd raised a daughter alone after her husband died when Lena was just 5 years old. She'd worked 2 jobs, one as a seamstress during the day, another cleaning office buildings at night, to keep them fed and housed. She'd taught Lena to be strong, to be resilient, to never accept no when she wanted something. What she hadn't taught her daughter was how to love someone the world deemed broken. The ballroom's energy shifted as waiters began emerging from the kitchen, carrying trays laden with the first course. The jazz quartet launched into a smooth rendition of Autumn Leaves. Conversations rose and fell like waves, punctuated by laughter and the gentle clink of silverware against china. At table 17, the food arrived with the same efficiency as the water, plates set down precisely, the server offering a brief nod before moving on to the next table. Eleanor looked down at her seared scallops with microgreens and wondered, not for the first time, why she'd agreed to come tonight. "Because Lena asked you to," a voice in her head supplied. "Because she's your daughter, and you keep hoping that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time she'll sit with you. Maybe this time she'll introduce you to her colleagues not as an afterthought, but as her mother. The woman who sacrificed everything so she could have the education, the opportunities, the life she has now. Maybe this time she won't be ashamed." "Grandma, you're not eating," Sophia noticed, her own fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Eleanor smiled and picked up her fork, making a show of tasting the scallop. It was perfectly cooked, buttery and tender, and it tasted like nothing at all. Nearby, at table 4, Lena sat between the mayor and a tech mogul who'd been trying to get a meeting with her for 6 months. She ate automatically, her movements graceful and practiced, while discussing the intersection of fashion and sustainable manufacturing. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, probably her assistant with an update on tomorrow's buyer presentation, but she ignored it. Tonight was about being seen, about maintaining the carefully curated image of Lena Whitmore, self-made billionaire, fashion visionary, philanthropic icon. Not Lena Whitmore, daughter of a deaf seamstress who'd once been so poor they'd eaten cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. Not Lena Whitmore, the girl whose mother picked her up from school in clothes that smelled like fabric dye and industrial cleaner. Not Lena Whitmore, the teenager who'd learned to pretend her mother wasn't there whenever friends came over. Those versions of herself had been buried decades ago, locked away in a mental vault Lena rarely opened. But tonight, with her mother sitting alone in the corner and her daughters confused and hurting, the vault door kept rattling. "Mommy!" Emma's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife. Lena's head snapped around. Emma stood beside her chair, having navigated the maze of tables with the determination only a 7-year-old could muster. Her pink dress had a small stain on the front, chocolate from one of the dessert samples being passed around, and her hair was coming loose from its braid. "Emma, sweetheart, you should be sitting with—" "Why doesn't Grandma sit with us?" Emma interrupted, her voice loud enough that several nearby tables fell silent, curious eyes turning their way. "Why is she all the way over there by the kitchen?" Lena's smile didn't waver, but something cold settled in her stomach. "Because Grandma prefers quieter spots, remember? We talked about this." "But she looks lonely, and the waiter was mean to her. He didn't even try to understand when she did the hand-talking." "Sign language," Lena corrected automatically, even as her mind raced for a way to redirect this conversation. "And I'm sure the waiter wasn't being mean. He was just busy." "Can you teach us sign language?" Emma pressed. "So we can talk to Grandma properly? Sophia said you used to know it." The mayor beside Lena had gone very still, his attention now fully focused on their exchange. Across the table, the tech mogul's wife leaned forward slightly, her expression openly interested. Lena could feel the moment crystallizing, becoming the kind of anecdote that would circulate through social circles. "Did you hear about Lena Whitmore's daughter at the gala? How precious, asking about her grandmother." "That's something we can discuss later, Emma," Lena said firmly, her hand settling on her daughter's shoulder with just enough pressure to communicate that this conversation was over. "Now, go back to your table. The main course will be arriving soon." "But, Mommy—" "Emma." The single word carried a note of warning that Emma, for all her boldness, recognized. Her small face fell, disappointment clouding her eyes. "Yes, Mommy." Lena watched her daughter trudge back across the ballroom. Her small shoulders slumped, and felt something twist in her chest. But she pushed it down, buried it beneath layers of justification and rationalization. She was protecting her daughters. She was protecting herself. She was protecting the life she'd built from the poverty and shame of her past. She was doing the right thing. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "You have a mother?" the mayor asked conversationally, his tone suggesting he'd heard about her father, the tragic widower who'd died when Lena was young, but never about Eleanor. "Yes," Lena replied, reaching for her water glass. "She raised me as a single parent, very private person, doesn't enjoy the spotlight much." It wasn't technically a lie. Eleanor was private. She didn't enjoy events like this, but the omission, the careful editing of the truth, sat heavily in Lena's stomach alongside the scallops and the champagne she'd been pretending to drink. The evening wore on. Speeches were made, checks were written. The silent auction closed with record-breaking bids. And through it all, Lena remained the perfect hostess, the gracious benefactor, the woman who had everything, except the courage to cross the ballroom and sit with her own mother. At table 17, Eleanor helped Grace cut her chicken, showed Emma how to fold her napkin into a swan, and smiled at Sophia's detailed explanation of her science project. The girls chattered around her, their voices creating a bubble of sound that she couldn't hear but could feel. The vibrations of their laughter, the movement of air when they gestured, the warmth of their small bodies pressed against her sides. She loved these children with a fierceness that surprised her sometimes. They were Lena's daughters, yes, but they were also pieces of her own heart, walking around outside her body and asking questions she couldn't answer. Why doesn't Mommy talk to you the way other people talk to their mothers? Why do you look sad sometimes when you watch her? Why don't you ever tell stories like other grandmas? The questions they hadn't learned to ask yet, but Eleanor could see forming in their eyes, in the way they studied her and Lena when they thought no one was watching. The main course plates were cleared. Dessert arrived, an elaborate chocolate construction that looked more like architecture than food. The girls squealed with delight, even Sophia temporarily abandoning her composure to clap her hands. And then something changed. The ballroom had begun the inevitable winding down of a successful event. Some guests had moved to the outdoor terrace for cigars and brandy. Others clustered around the bar, conducting the kind of business that happened in the margins of official meetings. The waitstaff had multiplied, clearing tables with practiced efficiency, black and white uniforms blurring as they moved through the thinning crowd. One of them paused beside table 17. But this one didn't hurry past. This one didn't avoid eye contact or pretend not to notice Eleanor's attempts to communicate. This one, a man in the simple uniform of the hotel's janitorial staff, older than the servers, with work-roughened hands and kind eyes, did something no one else had done all evening. He stopped. He saw. And then he knelt down beside Eleanor's chair and began to sign. His hands moved with the fluid certainty of someone who'd been speaking this language for years. Good evening. I'm sorry you've been struggling tonight. I've been working in the back, but I saw some of what happened earlier. May I help? Eleanor's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands flew up in response, moving with the speed and fluency of someone finally able to speak freely. You sign. Oh, thank God. I've been sitting here for 3 hours surrounded by people, and you're the first person who's actually tried to talk to me. The man's smile was warm, genuine. I'm Caleb. My late wife was deaf. I learned ASL when we were dating, and I've never stopped using it. It's part of who I am now. I'm Eleanor, she signed back. And even in the silence, her name felt important, acknowledged. These are my granddaughters, Sophia, Emma, and Grace. The triplets stared at the janitor with open fascination. Up close, they could see he was probably in his early 40s, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and tired lines around his eyes that spoke of long shifts and hard work. His janitorial uniform was clean but worn, the name tag slightly crooked on his chest. What are you saying to our grandma? Emma demanded, her natural boldness reasserting itself. Caleb looked at the girls, then back at Eleanor. May I? He signed. Please, Eleanor responded, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. Your grandmother and I are introducing ourselves, Caleb explained to the girls, his voice gentle and patient. I'm speaking to her in sign language, using my hands to make words, just like you use your voice. You can understand her. Sophia leaned forward, her scientific curiosity engaged. Like, you know what all those hand movements mean? Every single one, Caleb confirmed. Would you like to know what she was saying earlier when the waiter came? 3 heads nodded in unison. She was asking for water, just water. Nothing complicated. But because he didn't know sign language, he couldn't understand her. Caleb's expression was matter-of-fact, without judgment, but the girls looked stricken. That's not fair, Grace said quietly, her small hand finding Eleanor's again. Grandma should be able to ask for things. You're absolutely right, Caleb agreed. Everyone should be able to communicate and be understood. Across the ballroom, Lena had watched the janitor approach her mother's table with mild interest that quickly sharpened into something close to panic when she saw his hands moving in familiar patterns. She knew those gestures. She'd spent the first 14 years of her life fluent in them before she'd deliberately, systematically let the skill atrophy. Now watching her mother's face light up, truly light up in a way Lena hadn't seen in years, something cracked in her carefully maintained composure. Her mother was laughing, silent of course, but laughing in the way deaf people do, with her whole body, her eyes crinkled with genuine joy. The janitor was signing something that made Eleanor's shoulders shake with mirth, and the triplets were giggling along, caught up in their grandmother's happiness, even though they didn't understand the joke. Lena felt it like a physical blow, the realization that a stranger, a janitor, had given her mother something in 5 minutes that Lena hadn't provided in years. Connection, recognition, dignity. "Lena?" The mayor touched her arm lightly. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," she lied automatically. "Just tired. It's been a long evening." But she wasn't fine. She was watching her past and present collide in that corner of the ballroom, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Caleb had pulled out a small notepad from his pocket and was drawing simple figures, teaching the girls basic signs. "Hello," he demonstrated, waving his hand. "Thank you," touching his chin and moving his hand forward. "I love you," extending his thumb, index finger, and pinky. The triplets practiced eagerly, their small hands clumsy but enthusiastic. Emma signed hello to Eleanor approximately 15 times in a row, delighted each time her grandmother signed it back. Sophia studied the shapes critically, trying to perfect her finger positioning. Grace signed I love you once, then threw her arms around Eleanor's neck and said it out loud too, her voice muffled against her grandmother's shoulder. Eleanor held Grace tight, one hand stroking her granddaughter's hair, and looked up to find Lena watching from across the room. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Eleanor's expression held no accusation, no anger, no resentment, just a quiet, heartbreaking question that Lena could read as clearly as if it had been spelled out in the air between them. Why couldn't you do this? Why couldn't you be the one to bridge this gap? Lena turned away first, her jaw clenched so tightly she thought her teeth might crack. The evening wound down. Guests began their elaborate farewells, air-kissing and promising lunches they'd never schedule. Valets brought around cars, Mercedes, Bentleys, the occasional Tesla for the environmentally conscious billionaire. The jazz quartet packed up their instruments. The waitstaff cleared the last of the tables. And Caleb Moore, the janitor who'd stopped to kneel beside a lonely woman in a corner, taught 3 7-year-old girls 5 more signs before their bodyguard appeared to collect them, shepherding them toward where their mother waited by the coat check. "Thank you," Sophia said to Caleb, trying out her new sign for it. He signed it back, then offered his hand for a proper handshake, treating her with the same respect he'd show an adult. "Thank you for talking to Grandma," Emma added, hugging him impulsively around the waist. "You're nice." Grace simply waved, but her smile was radiant. Eleanor rose from her chair, her movement slower than when the evening had started, exhaustion written in the slope of her shoulders. But when she looked at Caleb, her hands moved with energy and purpose. "Thank you. You'll never know what this meant to me." "I think I do," he signed back. "My wife used to get that same look sometimes, that relief of finally being seen." He hesitated, then continued. "Your granddaughters are wonderful, smart, kind, curious. If you ever want them to learn more sign language, I'm just a janitor. I don't have formal teaching credentials, but I could show them some basics, if their parents were interested." Eleanor's smile was sad. "I don't think their mother would approve, but thank you for the offer. It means more than you know." Caleb nodded, understanding the weight of what she wasn't saying. He'd seen the woman in the designer gown watching from across the room. He'd seen the way she'd looked at him, at the situation, like it was a problem to be managed rather than a connection to be celebrated. He'd seen that look before, in the faces of people who'd pitied his wife rather than seeing her. "Miss Whitmore is waiting," the bodyguard announced politely, a large man in a dark suit who'd been hired more for his discretion than his intimidation factor. The triplets waved goodbye to Caleb and their grandmother, then scampered toward their mother like a pack of excited puppies. Eleanor followed more slowly, her purse clutched in her hands, her spine straight despite her exhaustion. Lena stood by the coat check, her own coat draped over her arm, her expression carefully neutral. As her daughters reached her, all talking at once about the nice man who talked with his hands and the new words they'd learned, Lena's eyes found Caleb across the thinning crowd. He was gathering trash bags from a cart, preparing to clear the tables now that the guests were gone. Just a janitor doing his job. Nothing remarkable. Nothing special. Except he'd done what Lena couldn't. What Lena wouldn't. He'd seen someone invisible and made them visible again. The valet brought Lena's car around, a black Mercedes S-Class that whispered rather than roared. The bodyguard helped Eleanor into the front seat while the triplets piled into the back, their excitement slowly giving way to the drowsy contentment of children who'd stayed up past their bedtime. Lena slid behind the wheel, her hands gripping the leather with white-knuckled intensity. The drive from Manhattan to her Westchester estate would take 45 minutes at this time of night. 45 minutes of her daughters chattering about sign language and the kind janitor. 45 minutes of her mother's silence pressing against her like a physical weight. 45 minutes to reinforce the walls she'd spent decades building. But as she pulled away from the Grand Celestial Hotel, Lena couldn't shake the image of her mother's face, lit up with joy because a stranger had shown her basic human kindness. The kind of kindness her own daughter couldn't manage. The city lights blurred past the windows, turning the world into streaks of gold and white and red. In the rearview mirror, Lena could see the triplets already starting to drift, their heads drooping against their seatbelts. Beside her, Eleanor stared out the passenger window, her hands folded in her lap, silent in every possible way. And in the back seat, just before sleep claimed her, Emma murmured, "Mommy, can we see the nice janitor again? I want to learn more signs so I can talk to Grandma properly." Lena's hands tightened on the wheel. "We'll see, baby," she said, the automatic response of parents everywhere who mean no, but don't want to say it yet. "But why not?" Emma persisted, fighting sleep with the determination of a child who sensed an important battle. "He was so nice, and Grandma was so happy. I've never seen her smile like that before." "Because seeing you with him made me realize I've been failing as a daughter for 20 years, Lena thought. Because watching a janitor do in 5 minutes what I haven't done in decades made me see myself clearly, and I don't like what I saw. Because I'm ashamed, and I don't know how to stop being ashamed, and it's easier to keep avoiding it than to face what I've become." "Because it's complicated, sweetheart," Lena said instead. "Now, close your eyes. We'll talk about it tomorrow." But tomorrow would bring new excuses, new justifications, new ways to avoid the truth, because that's what Lena Whitmore did best. She'd built an empire by avoiding the parts of herself she didn't want to see, by constructing a perfect facade and defending it at all costs. And tonight, a janitor named Caleb Moore had cracked that facade just enough for the light to get in. The question was whether Lena would seal the crack, or let it break her open completely. As the Mercedes purred through the night, carrying a billionaire CEO, her deaf mother, and 3 little girls who'd just learned their first signs, none of them knew that this evening was the beginning of something that would change them all. But in the Grand Celestial Ballroom, as Caleb Moore emptied trash cans and wiped down tables, he thought about the lonely woman in the corner and the daughter who couldn't look at her. He thought about his late wife and how she used to say that the opposite of love wasn't hate, it was invisibility. And he wondered if, perhaps, he'd just witnessed both at once. The following morning arrived with the kind of relentless sunshine that made everything look deceptively cheerful. Lena woke at 5:30 as she always did, her internal clock more reliable than any alarm. The estate was silent except for the distant hum of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast and the soft footfalls of the housekeeper making her early rounds. Lena lay in her king-sized bed, custom-made, imported Italian linens, a mattress that cost more than most cars, and stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of her mother's face from the night before. That moment when Eleanor had looked up at her across the ballroom, asking without words why her own daughter couldn't give her what a stranger had offered so freely. She threw back the covers with more force than necessary and headed to her bathroom, letting the familiar routine of her morning wash away the discomfort. Shower, skincare, hair, makeup. Each step was precise, practiced, transforming her from vulnerable to invincible. By the time she descended the curved staircase to the breakfast room, she was once again Lena Whitmore, CEO, dressed in crisp white pants and a silk blouse the color of champagne. The triplets were already at the table, still in their pajamas, their nanny Clara hovering nearby with juice and cut fruit. Eleanor sat at the far end, her plate mostly untouched, her eyes on the newspaper she couldn't hear being discussed on the television mounted discreetly in the corner. "Good morning," Lena said briskly, accepting the coffee her assistant held out without breaking stride. "Girls, you need to eat quickly. You have violin lessons at 9. "Mommy, can we ask you something?" Sophia set down her spoon with the deliberate care that meant she'd been appointed spokesperson. "After breakfast," Lena replied, scanning her phone for overnight emails. "We're running behind schedule already." It's about Grandma," Emma interjected, unable to contain herself, "and the nice man from last night." Lena's thumb froze mid-scroll. She looked up slowly, her expression carefully neutral. "What about them?" "We want to learn sign language," Grace said quietly, the words tumbling out in a rush as if she'd been gathering courage all morning. "So we can talk to Grandma like he did." The breakfast room went very still. Even the housekeeper, arranging fresh flowers on the sideboard, seemed to hold her breath. Eleanor's hands had stopped on the newspaper, her eyes lifting to her daughter's face with an expression Lena couldn't quite read. "That's not necessary," Lena said, her voice calm, reasonable. "Grandma understands you just fine. She can read lips, and you can write things down if you need to communicate something specific." "But it's not the same," Sophia argued, her scientific mind already identifying the flaw in this logic. "Reading lips isn't like real conversation, Mrs. Patterson said so when we learned about it. And writing takes forever." "Mrs. Patterson doesn't understand our family situation," Lena countered, setting her phone down with deliberate care. "Now finish your breakfast. We'll discuss this later." "You always say that." Emma's voice rose slightly, frustration coloring her words. "You said it last night, and now you're saying it again. Why won't you just teach us? You know sign language. We saw you watching when the janitor was signing with Grandma. You knew what he was saying." Lena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Of course they'd noticed. Children always noticed the things you most wanted to hide. "I used to know some signs. That was a long time ago. I've forgotten most of it." It was perhaps the most blatant lie she'd ever told her daughters, and from the way Eleanor's hands clenched on the newspaper, she knew her mother recognized it as such. "Then maybe the janitor could teach us," Emma pressed. "He said he'd be happy to, remember? He told Grandma that if we wanted to learn, he could show us basics." "Absolutely not." Lena's voice came out sharper than she intended. "That man is a stranger. We don't know anything about him." "You hire strangers all the time," Sophia pointed out with devastating logic. "Clara was a stranger when you hired her, and Marco, and the gardeners, and the security people." "That's different. They go through extensive background checks and—" Lena stopped, realizing she was arguing with a 7-year-old and losing. She took a breath, forcing her voice back to calm. "The answer is no. Now please finish your breakfast or you'll be late for your lessons." The triplets exchanged glances, that silent communication that multiples seem to possess, and Lena knew this conversation was far from over. But for now, they turned back to their food, eating in the kind of pointed silence that only children could achieve. Eleanor rose from this table, her movements careful and controlled. She caught Lena's eye briefly, and in that glance was a lifetime of disappointment so familiar it barely registered anymore. Then she was gone, retreating to the guest suite where she stayed during her weekly visits, leaving Lena alone with her daughters and the lies she'd just told. The day proceeded with its usual relentless efficiency. Violin lessons, followed by a tutoring session in mathematics, followed by the triplets' weekly writing lesson at the estate's stables. Lena spent the morning in video conferences with her European distributors, the afternoon reviewing designs for the spring collection, and the early evening on a call with her divorce attorney discussing the custody arrangements with her ex-husband, Richard. "He's pushing for full weekends," the attorney said, her voice crisp and professional through the phone. "Claims that your travel schedule makes consistent parenting difficult." Lena pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. "My travel schedule has been the same for 3 years." "Why is this an issue now?" "Because he's engaged to someone new and wants to play happy family. the attorney replied with the kind of brutal honesty Lena paid her for. Look, he doesn't have a case. You're the primary caregiver. You've been consistent and present, and the girls are thriving. But be prepared for him to make noise about it. After the call ended, Lena stood at her office window, looking out over the manicured grounds. In the distance, she could see the triplets on the lawn with Clara, attempting to teach their old golden retriever a new trick. Their laughter carried faintly through the glass, and something in Lena's chest tightened. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Whitmore, this is Caleb Moore. I hope it's all right that I'm reaching out. Your mother asked me to teach your daughters some basic ASL, and I wanted to check if that would be acceptable. I understand if it's not. I just wanted to offer. Lena stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the delete button. How had he gotten her number? From her mother, obviously. Eleanor must have written it down for him, must have orchestrated this entire thing. The audacity of it should have made her angry. Instead, she felt something closer to panic. She deleted the message without responding. But that evening, as she supervised the triplets' dinner and reviewed their homework, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Caleb Moore, a janitor, offering to teach her daughters for free something that Lena had deliberately kept from them for 7 years. "Mommy, you're not listening," Emma complained, waving her math worksheet in front of Lena's face. "I asked if you could check problem 7. "Sorry, baby." Lena forced herself to focus on the paper, on the careful numbers written in Emma's still-developing handwriting. "Let's see. You carried the one correctly here, but look at this column." They worked through the problems together, Lena's expertise in numbers serving her well even in second-grade mathematics. But part of her attention remained elsewhere, stuck on a question she didn't want to examine too closely. What was she so afraid of? The answer came 3 days later, on Thursday afternoon. Lena had taken the afternoon off, a rarity, to attend the triplets' school spring showcase, where each grade performed songs and presented projects to parents. She sat in the auditorium's third row, her assistant beside her handling urgent emails, watching as Sophia, Emma, and Grace performed a choreographed piece about the water cycle. They were wonderful, coordinated, enthusiastic, singing with the unselfconscious joy of children who didn't yet know to be afraid of judgment. Lena's heart swelled with pride, and she pulled out her phone to record a video, capturing the moment to watch again later when the demands of work threatened to overwhelm the reality of why she worked so hard in the first place. The performance ended to enthusiastic applause. Parents stood, some dabbing at their eyes, others already heading for the exits to beat the parking lot traffic. Lena remained seated, watching as the children filed off stage, when a voice beside her said, "They're beautiful girls." She turned to find an older woman, perhaps 60, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Thank you," Lena replied automatically. "I'm Mrs. Patterson," the woman continued. "I teach the second-grade class. Your daughters are exceptional students, curious, engaged, and remarkably kind to their classmates." "I appreciate that." Lena began gathering her things, signaling the end of the conversation, but Mrs. Patterson didn't move. "They've been asking me a lot of questions about sign language this week," the teacher said, her tone carefully neutral. "About deaf culture, about communication methods, about whether the school offers ASL classes." Lena's hand stilled on her purse. "I see." "They mentioned wanting to learn to communicate better with their grandmother." Mrs. Patterson's expression was gentle but firm. "I thought you should know that I offered to teach them some basics during lunch period. Just simple things. The alphabet, common phrases, if that's all right with you, of course." The question hung in the air between them, and Lena found herself at a crossroads she'd been avoiding for years. She could say no, could shut this down the way she'd shut down Caleb Moore's offer, could continue the pattern of avoidance and denial that had characterized her relationship with her mother for decades. Or she could let go. Just a little. Just enough. "That would be fine," Lena heard herself say, the words emerging before she'd fully decided to speak them. "Thank you for offering." Mrs. Patterson's smile was warm, approving. "Wonderful. We'll start tomorrow. And Ms. Whitmore, your daughters told me about a janitor who signed with their grandmother at an event. They were quite taken with him." "Yes, well, children are easily impressed," Lena said, her defenses rising automatically. Perhaps. Mrs. Patterson tilted her head slightly. Or perhaps they recognized something important when they saw it. Children have a way of cutting through our adult complications and seeing what really matters. She walked away before Lena could respond, leaving her standing in the emptying auditorium with the weight of that observation settling on her shoulders. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again, her mind replaying moments from the past week, her mother's face at the gala, the triplets practicing the few signs Caleb had taught them, Mrs. Patterson's gentle but pointed observation about children seeing what matters. At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs to her office. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the soft hum of the refrigerator. She turned on her computer and pulled up the security footage from the gala. The estate's security team had compiled it as they did for all of Lena's public events. She fast-forwarded to the moment when Caleb had approached table 17, watched as he knelt beside her mother, watched as Eleanor's face transformed from polite endurance to genuine joy, watched as her daughters leaned in, fascinated, as he taught them their first signs. And then she watched herself, standing across the ballroom, deliberately turning away. The woman on the screen looked powerful, confident, untouchable. She also looked cold, distant, like someone who'd traded connection for control and convinced herself it was worth it. Lena closed the video player, her hands trembling slightly. Her phone showed the deleted message from Caleb was still in her recently deleted folder. She retrieved it, reading it again in the glow of her computer screen. Before she could second-guess herself, she typed a response. Mr. Moore, this is Lena Whitmore. I apologize for the delayed response. If your offer still stands, I would appreciate you teaching my daughters some basic sign language. I can compensate you for your time. Please let me know your rate and availability. She hit send before she could change her mind, then sat back in her chair, her heart pounding as if she'd just made a dangerous business deal rather than a simple arrangement for her children's education. The response came faster than she expected. It was only 2 a.m, but apparently Caleb Moore was also awake. Miss Whitmore, I don't need compensation. I'd be happy to teach them. I work nights at the Grand Celestial, but I'm free most afternoons. Would weekends work? I could come to you, or we could meet somewhere public if you'd prefer. Lena stared at the message. Most people in her world wanted something, a connection, an investment, an opportunity. But Caleb Moore, a janitor who worked night shifts to support himself, was offering his time for free. Weekends would work, she typed. Saturday afternoons. You may come to the estate. I'll have my assistant send you the address and gate code. Thank you. I'll see you this Saturday at 2 p.m. That's acceptable. Lena set down her phone and sat in the darkness of her office, wondering what she'd just set in motion. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp spring weather that made everything feel possible. The triplets had been vibrating with excitement since Lena announced at breakfast that a teacher would be coming to give them sign language lessons. She'd kept the details vague, unwilling to see their reactions when they realized it was Caleb. Eleanor had been visiting for the weekend, and when Lena told her about the arrangement, her mother's hands had moved in response, quick, emphatic gestures that Lena understood despite her claims of forgotten fluency. You're allowing this? The girls want to learn, Lena had signed back, her hands rusty but functional. I'm not doing it for you. The lie tasted bitter even in sign, and from Eleanor's expression she knew it was a lie too. But she'd simply nodded, her hands falling still, and retreated to the garden where she spent most of her weekend mornings tending to the roses Lena's gardeners maintained. At 1:55 p.m., the security gate called. Ms. Whitmore, there's a Caleb Moore here to see you. Send him through. Lena positioned herself in the entrance hall, her posture perfect, her expression composed. She'd dressed casually, jeans and a cashmere sweater, but still managed to look like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Armor, she recognized. Even on her own property, she needed armor. The doorbell rang exactly at 2 p.m., punctual. She could appreciate that. She opened the door herself, waving off the housekeeper, and found Caleb Moore standing on her marble steps looking distinctly uncomfortable. He'd traded his janitorial uniform for jeans and a button-down shirt, his hair still damp from a recent shower. In his hands, he held a worn backpack that had seen better days. Mr. Moore, Lena said formally. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Whitmore. He nodded, his posture respectful but not subservient. Up close, in the afternoon light, she could see the weariness in his eyes, the lines that came from working night shifts and raising a child alone. I appreciate you allowing me to do this. The girls are excited to learn. Lena stepped back, allowing him to enter the house. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the soaring ceilings, the original artwork, the chandelier that cost more than he probably made in a year. But he didn't comment, didn't gawk, just followed her through the house with quiet dignity. Caleb! The triplets appeared from the library like a small tornado, all talking at once, their excitement palpable. You came! Emma threw herself at him with the casual affection of children who hadn't yet learned to maintain proper boundaries with adults. Caleb caught her easily, his laugh warm and genuine. I promised I would, didn't I? And I brought supplies. He held up his backpack. I have flashcards and a chart and some books if you want to learn more on your own. Can we start now? Sophia bounced on her toes, her usual composure abandoned in the face of this new learning opportunity. If your mother says it's okay. Caleb glanced at Lena, and she saw no judgment in his eyes, no accusation, just a simple question. The sunroom is set up for you, Lena said, gesturing down the hall. I'll have refreshments brought in. If you need anything... Mommy, aren't you going to stay? Grace asked, her small hand finding Lena's. You could learn too. Lena's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat to her office and let Caleb do what she'd hired him for. Except she hadn't hired him, had she? He was doing this for free, out of kindness, the way he'd stopped at the gala out of simple human decency, the way she should have stopped herself. I have work to do, Lena began, but Caleb interrupted her gently. Actually, it might help if you were there, he said. The girls will pick things up faster if they have someone to practice with at home, and your mother would probably enjoy having more people to sign with. It was masterfully done. No pressure, no judgment, just practical logic that Lena couldn't argue with without revealing exactly what she was avoiding. Fine, she heard herself say. I'll stay for the first lesson. The sunroom was flooded with afternoon light, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden where Eleanor tended her roses. Caleb sat up at the low table Lena used for informal meetings, spreading out his materials with the ease of someone who'd done this before. All right, he said, settling cross-legged on the floor with the triplets arranged in a semicircle before him. First things first, sign language isn't just about making shapes with your hands. It's a complete language with grammar, structure, and culture. When you sign, you're not just translating English, you're speaking a different language entirely. The girls nodded solemnly, hanging on his every word. Now, we're going to start with the alphabet, but I also want to teach you some practical phrases, things you can use right away with your grandmother. Sound good? Yes, the triplets chorused. Lena sat in a chair slightly behind them, close enough to observe but separate enough to maintain distance. She watched as Caleb's hands moved through the alphabet, each letter clear and precise, the girls mimicking him with varying degrees of success. Good. Emma, that's an excellent B. Sophia, watch your thumb position on the D, Grace, perfect M. They moved through the alphabet twice, then Caleb introduced basic greetings. Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thank you, you're welcome. And despite herself, despite the armor she'd carefully constructed over decades, Lena found her hands moving along with the girls, muscle memory awakening after years of deliberate disuse. The signs felt foreign and familiar at once, like a language she'd spoken in childhood and forgotten, only to find it still lived somewhere in her bones. Ms. Whitmore, you're quite good at this, Caleb observed, his tone neutral but his eyes knowing. Have you studied ASL before? The triplets turned to stare at their mother, surprise written across their identical faces. A long time ago, Lena said carefully. As I mentioned, I've forgotten most of it. But even as she spoke, her hands were signing, I'm fine, thank you, with perfect fluency, her fingers moving through the familiar patterns without conscious thought. Caleb didn't call her on the obvious lie. He simply nodded and turned back to the girls. Let's try some useful phrases. This is I love you. He demonstrated the sign, thumb, index finger, and pinky extended. This is one you'll want to use a lot with your grandmother. The triplets practiced it eagerly, their small hands clumsy but earnest. And then Grace turned to Lena and signed it directly at her, her face glowing with pride. "I love you, Mommy." Lena's throat tightened. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them, returning the sign automatically. "I love you too, sweetheart." Grace's eyes widened. "Mommy, you do remember. You just signed back to me." Lena faltered, caught in her own deception. Across the garden, visible through the sunroom windows, Eleanor had straightened from her roses, her attention fixed on the scene inside. Even from this distance, Lena could see the question in her mother's posture. "Why did you say you forgot?" Sophia asked, her logical mind already working through the inconsistency. "If you can sign, why don't you ever sign with Grandma?" It was the question Lena had been avoiding for 20 years, asked with the devastating directness of a 7-year-old who didn't yet understand that some truths were too painful to speak aloud. "That's complicated," Lena managed. "Adults always say that when they don't want to answer," Emma pointed out, earning a surprised laugh from Caleb. "She's not wrong," he agreed. He looked at Lena with an expression that was gentle but unflinching. "But sometimes complicated things are worth talking about anyway." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. The triplets watched their mother with identical expressions of curious expectation. Caleb waited patiently, his hands still, his posture relaxed. And through the window, Eleanor stood frozen among her roses, waiting for an answer to a question that had haunted their relationship for decades. Lena stood abruptly. "I need to make a phone call. Please continue with the lesson." She walked out before anyone could respond, her heels clicking against the marble with staccato urgency. She made it to her office, closed the door, and leaned against it, her carefully controlled breathing threatening to spiral into something closer to panic. She'd spent 20 years building walls, 20 years creating distance, 20 years convincing herself that protecting her image, protecting her daughters from the shame she'd felt as a child, was the right choice. And in one afternoon, a janitor and 3 7-year-olds had started dismantling everything she'd built. Her phone rang. Richard, her ex-husband. She ignored it. It rang again, her attorney. She let it go to voicemail. The world could wait. For once, the world could wait. Through her office window, she could see the sunroom, could see Caleb patiently correcting Grace's finger positioning, while Emma peppered him with questions about deaf culture, and Sophia took notes in her precise handwriting. Could see her daughters, her beautiful, curious, kind daughters, learning something she'd deliberately withheld from them. And beyond the sunroom, in the garden, Eleanor had resumed her rose tending, but her movements were slower now, distracted, as if she too was waiting for something to break. Lena pulled out her phone and opened her photo gallery, scrolling back years to images she rarely looked at. There, a picture from when she was 14, standing beside her mother at a school event. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made herself, slightly too formal for a science fair, but the best she had. Lena stood slightly apart, her body language screaming embarrassment, her eyes refusing to meet the camera. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity, remembered how her mother had tried to tell her she was proud, her hands moving in enthusiastic signs. Remembered how Lena had turned away, pretending not to understand, leaving Eleanor signing to empty air while other parents watched with pity and discomfort. Remembered the look on her mother's face when she realized her own daughter was ashamed of her. Lena closed the photo, her hands trembling. A soft knock on the door made her straighten, quickly wiping her eyes. "Come in." Caleb entered, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. "The girls are practicing with flashcards. I told them I needed to discuss scheduling with you." "Is there a problem with Saturday afternoons?" "No problem at all." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Ms. Whitmore, I don't know your situation, and it's none of my business, but I've been where you are." Lena's spine stiffened. "I don't think—" "My wife was deaf," Caleb continued quietly, not backing down despite her defensive posture. "And when we first started dating, I was terrified. Terrified of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, of people staring at us in restaurants or stores. Terrified that loving her meant signing up for a lifetime of other people's judgment and pity." Despite herself, Lena found herself listening. "I almost walked away," Caleb admitted, more than once, because it seemed easier to find someone who fit the normal mold, someone who wouldn't require me to learn a new language or face uncomfortable stares, or explain things to strangers. What changed? Lena asked quietly. I realized I was more afraid of losing her than I was of what other people thought. His eyes were steady, kind, but unflinching in their honesty. I realized that my discomfort wasn't worth more than her dignity, and I realized that the people judging us said a lot more about them than it did about us. It's not the same, Lena said, but her voice lacked conviction. You chose to be with her. I didn't choose to have a deaf mother. No, you didn't, Caleb agreed. But you're choosing every day whether to honor her or hide her, and your daughters are watching which choice you make. The words landed like physical blows, true and terrible. Lena turned away, looking out the window at Eleanor, still tending her roses with patient dedication. I was ashamed, Lena whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside. I was a child, and I was ashamed of my own mother, and by the time I was old enough to know better, I'd already built my entire life around that shame. How do I come back from that? One sign at a time, Caleb said simply. One conversation at a time, one moment of choosing differently. It's too late. I've hurt her too much for too long. Maybe. Caleb moved to stand beside her at the window. Or maybe she's out there tending roses that she tends every weekend, coming back to a house where her daughter won't speak to her in her own language, because she's hoping that someday you'll remember who you were before you decided to forget. Lena's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have to do it alone, Caleb said. And you don't have to do it all at once. Just show up. The rest will follow. He left her there, standing at the window, watching her mother tend roses in a garden that wasn't hers, in a house where she was a guest rather than family. And Lena made a decision. She walked out of her office, through the house, and into the garden. Eleanor didn't hear her approach, of course she didn't, but she must have sensed the shadow because she turned and her eyes widened when she saw Lena standing there. For a long moment, neither of them moved. 20 years of silence, of distance, of careful avoidance stretched between them like an impassable gulf. Then Lena's hands moved, rusty and uncertain, but clear enough. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. Eleanor's pruning shears fell from her hands, landing softly in the mulch. Her own hands lifted, trembling, and signed back through tears that fell freely down her weathered cheeks. I've been waiting so long to hear you say that. They stood in the afternoon sunlight, in a garden perfumed with roses, and 20 years of silence. Finally began to break. Eleanor's hand shook as she signed back, her fingers forming words that had waited decades to be spoken. I thought I'd lost you forever. I thought my daughter was gone and only this stranger was left. Lena's composure cracked completely. She sank onto the garden bench, her designer jeans pressing into the weathered wood, and buried her face in her hands. The sobs came from somewhere deep, a place she'd locked away when she was 16 and decided that survival meant erasure, that success meant forgetting where she came from. Eleanor sat beside her, one hand resting on Lena's trembling shoulder. She didn't sign, didn't try to force conversation. She just sat. The way she'd sat through Lena's childhood tantrums and teenage heartbreaks, offering the silent comfort of presence when words, signed or spoken, wouldn't suffice. Inside the sunroom, 3 small faces pressed against the glass, watching their mother fall apart in their grandmother's arms. Caleb gently guided them away, redirecting their attention to the flashcards, but the lesson had lost its momentum. The girls kept glancing toward the garden, sensing that something profound was shifting in their family's foundation. When Lena finally lifted her face, her makeup was ruined, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark rivulets. She looked at her mother and signed with hands that remembered more than she'd admitted to anyone, including herself. I was so angry at you when I was young, angry that you couldn't hear me when I called for you, angry that other kids' mothers could answer the phone when the school called, angry that you made me different. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her hands moved slowly, deliberately. You had every right to be angry. Being different is hard, especially for children. But you weren't the problem, Lena continued, the signs coming faster now as muscle memory took over. I was. I made you the problem because it was easier than dealing with my own shame, easier than standing up to the kids who mocked the way you talked, easier than educating people who pitied you. You were a child, Eleanor signed. Children aren't supposed to carry that weight. I'm not a child anymore. Lena's hands fell to her lap. I haven't been for 20 years, and I've spent every single one of those years treating you like you were my burden instead of my mother. The truth hung between them, sharp and painful. A robin landed nearby, pecking at the mulch, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beside the roses. The afternoon sun had started its slow descent, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Why didn't you say something? Lena signed finally. Why did you let me treat you that way? Eleanor's smile was sad but not bitter. Because you're my daughter. Because I hoped that eventually you'd remember who we were before the world taught you to be ashamed. And because forcing you would have driven you further away. I don't know how to fix this, Lena signed, the admission devastating in its honesty. I don't know how to be your daughter again. You're doing it right now, Eleanor replied, her hands gentle but certain. You're here. You're signing. You're letting yourself be vulnerable instead of perfect. That's all I've ever wanted. From the sunroom, Emma's voice carried faintly through the glass. Is Mommy okay? Why is she crying? Caleb's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever he said seemed to satisfy the girls enough that they returned to their practice, though their attention remained divided between flashcards and the garden. Lena wiped her eyes with the backs of her hands, smearing her mascara further. She probably looked like a disaster, and for once, she didn't care. The girls keep asking why I never told them about sign language, why I never taught them to communicate with you properly. Eleanor tilted her head, waiting. When Lena continued in spoken English, her mother pulled out the small notepad she always carried, ready to bridge the gap. I told myself I was protecting them, Lena said quietly, that if they didn't learn sign language, they wouldn't be different, wouldn't be marked the way I felt marked growing up. They could just be normal kids with a normal life. She paused, watching Eleanor write down her response with the precise handwriting she'd developed over decades of written communication. And how is that working out? Lena laughed, a broken sound that held no humor. They're confused. They feel disconnected from you. And they think I'm either a liar or deliberately keeping something from them. Which I am. Eleanor wrote again, her pen moving with firm strokes. You're protecting yourself, not them. You always have been. The words struck like a slap, true and terrible. Lena wanted to argue, to defend herself, but what defense could she offer? Eleanor was right. Everything Lena had done, the distance, the avoidance, the careful construction of a life that didn't include sign language or deaf culture or any acknowledgement of where she'd come from, had been about protecting her own fragile sense of belonging in a world that had taught her that different was wrong. I don't know how to be different now, Lena whispered. My entire company, my entire reputation, it's all built on this image of perfection. If I start signing publicly, if I acknowledge you openly, people will ask questions. They'll want to know why I never mentioned having a deaf mother. They'll realize I've been hiding you for years. Eleanor's pen moved again. And that terrifies you more than losing your own mother? The question landed like a punch to the gut. Lena opened her mouth to respond, to offer some rationalization, but the truth was inescapable. Yes, it did terrify her. The thought of her carefully constructed image crumbling, of people seeing her as the ashamed daughter who'd hidden her own mother, of the pity and judgment and questions, it terrified her more than anything, more than her mother's pain, more than her daughter's confusion, more than the slowly widening gulf between the person she was and the person she pretended to be. I'm a terrible person, Lena said finally, the words barely audible. Eleanor set down her pen and took Lena's face in her hands, forcing her daughter to meet her eyes. She shook her head firmly, then picked up the pen again. You're a hurt person who learned the wrong lessons. There's a difference. I've hurt you for so long. How can you even stand to be near me? Because I'm your mother, Eleanor wrote, and because I remember who you were before the world broke you. That girl is still in there, Lena. I see her sometimes when you think no one is watching. Inside the sunroom, Caleb had given up on flashcards entirely. The triplets sat in a row on the couch, their attention fixed on the garden, and he'd joined them, 3 children and 1 adult, bearing witness to something they didn't fully understand but recognized as important. Is Grandma mad at Mommy? Grace asked quietly. I don't think so, Caleb replied, keeping his voice gentle. I think they're having a very important conversation that's been waiting a long time to happen. Mommy never cries, Sophia observed, her analytical mind trying to process this unprecedented display of emotion. Not even when Daddy moved out. Sometimes we hold things in for so long that when they finally come out, it's like a dam breaking, Caleb explained. Your mom has been holding in a lot of feelings for a very long time. Emma pressed her nose against the glass. I want to hug her. Soon, Caleb promised. Let them finish talking first. In the garden, Eleanor had released Lena's face and picked up her notepad again. The girls asked me once why you don't sign with me. I told them you were busy. They didn't believe me. What do they think? They think you're ashamed of me, Eleanor wrote, and there was no accusation in the words, just statement of fact. And they're not wrong, are they? Lena flinched. I am. I don't know. She ran her hands through her hair, destroying the careful styling. When I was 14, Sarah Jenkins had a pool party. All the popular girls were invited. I begged you not to pick me up in front of her house. But you didn't understand. I'd gotten the time wrong, and you arrived an hour early. Eleanor's hands stilled on the notepad, memory clearly dawning. You came to the door to check if I was ready, Lena continued, her voice thick with old shame. And Sarah's mother answered, and you tried to explain in your voice, your deaf voice, that you were there for me. She didn't understand, and she called for Sarah, and soon there were 5 girls standing there watching my mother struggle to communicate. Tears started flowing again, but Lena didn't stop. I came to the door, and you were so happy to see me. Your whole face lit up. And I looked at you, looked at those girls watching with pity and disgust and curiosity, and I signed, go away, come back later. You're embarrassing me. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she remembered this moment as clearly as Lena did. You understood. Of course you understood. And you left, but not before I saw your face. You tried to hide it, tried to smile like it was fine, but I saw the hurt. I saw how I'd wounded you. Lena's voice cracked. And instead of feeling guilty, instead of running after you, I went back inside and told those girls you were our housekeeper, who didn't speak English well. I erased you completely. The robin flew away, disturbed by Lena's rising voice. In the distance, the estate's gardeners were packing up their tools, their workday ending, while Lena's reckoning was just beginning. I remember, Eleanor signed simply. I cried all the way home. But I also understood. I'd been 14 once too. I knew what it was like to want to fit in. But you came back, Lena signed back. You kept coming to my events, kept showing up, kept trying, even though I kept pushing you away. Why? Because giving up on you would have been easier, Eleanor replied. And I've never believed in taking the easy way. Lena stood abruptly, pacing the small garden path. That janitor, Caleb, he said something to me today. He said his wife was deaf, and he almost walked away because being with her meant facing other people's judgment, but he chose her anyway. Eleanor nodded, waiting for Lena to continue. I didn't choose you, you're my mother, but I've spent my entire adult life walking away anyway, slowly, incrementally, until there was so much distance between us I convinced myself it was normal. Lena stopped pacing, turning to face Eleanor fully. I want to choose differently now, but I don't know if it's too late. Eleanor stood, moving with the careful grace of someone whose body was starting to feel its years. She crossed to Lena and took both her daughter's hands in hers. When she signed, she did it slowly, making sure Lena caught every word. It's never too late to choose love over fear, but Lena, if you do this, you can't do it halfway. The girls will need consistency. I will need consistency. You can't sign with me in private and ignore me in public. You can't teach them to love their grandmother while being ashamed of her yourself. The truth of it settled on Lena's shoulders like a mantle, heavy and inescapable. Eleanor was right. This couldn't be a private reformation, a quiet apology that left the public image intact. Real change, real healing, would require Lena to dismantle the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her entire life. I have a board meeting Tuesday, Lena said quietly. With all my major investors, I could bring you, introduce you properly, as my mother. Could you? Eleanor signed, or would you? I don't know, Lena admitted. The thought makes me want to vomit. But so does the thought of continuing like this. Eleanor's smile was gentle but firm. Then you need to decide what you're more afraid of, other people's judgment, or losing your family. Before Lena could respond, the sunroom door burst open and three small bodies barreled out, unable to contain themselves any longer. Emma reached them first, throwing her arms around Lena's waist with enough force to nearly knock her over. "Mommy, are you okay? You were crying for so long." Grace attached herself to Lena's leg while Sophia hung back slightly, her eyes searching her mother's face for answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Lena knelt down, gathering all three girls into her arms, not caring that her expensive sweater was getting grass-stained or that her hair was a disaster. "I'm okay, babies. Grandma and I were just talking about some grown-up things." "Can we learn more signs now?" Emma asked, her resilience already bouncing her back from worry to enthusiasm. "Caleb taught us how to sign 'I'm hungry' and 'thank you' and 'please,' but we want to learn how to have real conversations with Grandma." "Like you were having," Sophia added, her observation cutting straight to the heart of things, as usual. "You were signing with her. Real signing, not just a few words. You do remember everything, don't you?" Lena looked up at Eleanor, who stood watching the scene with an expression of such profound hope and fear mingled together that it hurt to witness. Then she looked at Caleb, who'd followed the girls out at a more sedate pace and now stood at a respectful distance, witnessing this family's implosion and reconstruction with the quiet understanding of someone who'd walked this path himself. "Yes," Lena said finally, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "I remember everything. I've always remembered. I stopped using it." "Why?" Grace asked with the simplicity of a child who couldn't fathom deliberately choosing not to communicate with someone you loved. Lena took a deep breath. This was it. The moment where she could either retreat back into comfortable lies or step forward into uncomfortable truth. "Because when I was younger, I was embarrassed. Kids at school made fun of me because my mom was different. And instead of being proud of her, instead of teaching them that different doesn't mean bad, I hid her away. I pretended she didn't exist. And by the time I grew up enough to know better, I'd already built my whole life around that lie." The triplets processed this in their own ways. Emma's face scrunched up in confusion. Sophia's eyes widened with understanding. Grace simply tightened her grip on Lena's hand. "That was mean," Emma declared finally. "Grandma isn't embarrassing. She's wonderful." "You're right," Lena agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "She is wonderful, and I was mean. I was very, very mean for a very long time." "Are you going to stop being mean now?" Grace asked. "I'm going to try very hard to stop being mean," Lena promised. She stood, still holding Grace's hand, and faced her mother. Her hands moved, signing clearly enough for the girls to follow the simple words. "I love you, Mom. I'm sorry I forgot how to show it." Eleanor's face crumpled. She signed back through tears. "I love you too. I never stopped. Not even when you stopped signing. Not even when you stopped looking at me." The triplets watched this exchange with rapt attention, their newly acquired vocabulary just barely enough to catch the meaning. Emma tugged on Caleb's sleeve. "They're saying I love you, right? That's what Grandma signed." "That's exactly what she signed," Caleb confirmed, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Can you teach us more?" Sophia asked, "so we can understand everything?" "I think that's a question for your mother," Caleb said gently, directing their attention back to Lena. Three pairs of identical green eyes fixed on their mother expectantly. And Lena, standing in the garden where she'd just torn down 20 years of walls, made another choice. "Yes," she said, "Caleb will keep teaching you, and I'll teach you too. And we'll all learn together how to talk to Grandma the way she deserves to be talked to." The girls erupted in cheers, jumping and hugging and chattering all at once. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the backs of her hands, and when she met Lena's gaze, something had shifted. Not completely healed, decades of pain couldn't be erased in one afternoon, but begun. The process of reconstruction had started. Over the next 2 weeks, the Whitmore estate underwent a quiet transformation. Caleb came every Saturday afternoon, and the lessons expanded from basic signs to conversational fluency. The girls threw themselves into learning with the intense focus of children who'd discovered something magical. They practiced at breakfast, signing "Good morning" and "What's for dinner," and arguing in ASL about whose turn it was to feed the dog. Eleanor bloomed under this sudden attention. She told stories with her hands, stories about Lena's childhood, about her own youth, about the grandfather the girls had never known. She taught them baking recipes in sign language, her hands floury as she demonstrated the proper way to knead bread while simultaneously explaining each step. The kitchen became a place of laughter and flying flour and gentle corrections of finger positions. And Lena, despite her initial resistance, found herself pulled into this new rhythm. She worked from home more often, rearranging meetings and conference calls to be present for dinner. She sat with Eleanor and the girls in the evenings, her hands slowly regaining their fluency, muscle memory and deliberate practice combining to resurrect a language she'd tried to bury. But it wasn't easy. Some mornings, Lena woke with anxiety clawing at her throat, terrified of what she was building, of how exposed she was making herself. She'd built her entire empire on control, on careful image management, on never letting anyone see weakness or vulnerability. And here she was, learning to communicate in a language that required both hands be visible, that demanded full presence and attention, that couldn't be hidden or minimized. The real test came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after that afternoon in the garden. Lena stood in her closet, staring at her wardrobe with unusual indecision. She had the quarterly board meeting in 2 hours. 12 investors, all men except for one woman who'd made her fortune in tech, all powerful, all expecting the usual polished presentation of L.W. Couture's stellar performance. She'd invited Eleanor to attend. The decision had been made in a moment of bravery at midnight 2 days ago, when Lena had texted her mother's phone knowing Eleanor wouldn't see it until morning, but needing to commit before she could change her mind. Board meeting Tuesday at 10 a.m. Would you like to come? I'd like to introduce you properly. Eleanor's response had come within minutes, which meant she'd been awake too, probably reading in the guest room where she now stayed most weekends. I would be honored. Now, with the meeting approaching, Lena's courage was evaporating rapidly. She pulled out a navy suit, professional, authoritative, armor, and dressed mechanically, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What if the board members were uncomfortable? What if they questioned her judgment? What if they saw this as a weakness, a distraction from business? What if they looked at Eleanor the way those girls had at Sarah Jenkins' pool party? "Mommy?" Grace appeared in the closet doorway, still in her pajamas. "Are you okay? You're making your worried face." Lena forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about my meeting." "The one where Grandma gets to come?" Grace climbed onto the small ottoman where Lena usually sat to put on her shoes. "She's really excited. She picked out her best dress." "I'm glad." Lena's hands fumbled with her necklace clasp. "Are you scared?" Grace asked, with the unnerving perceptiveness of children who were learning to read more than just sign language. Lena's hands stilled. She could lie, maintain the illusion of maternal invincibility, or she could honor the honesty she'd promised in that garden. "A little bit, yes." "Why?" "Grandma is nice. Everyone will like her." "Not everyone understands people who are different," Lena said carefully. "Some people might be uncomfortable or confused." Grace considered this seriously. "Then those people are silly. Being different is interesting. Sophia read us a book about it at school." From the mouths of babes, Lena thought. She knelt down, bringing herself to Grace's eye level. "You're absolutely right. Being different is interesting. I just need to remember that." "We could come with you," Grace offered. "Me and Emma and Sophia. We could show everyone our signing. We're getting really good." "Caleb said so." "That's very sweet, but you have school. We could skip just this once." Grace's face brightened with the excitement of potential rule breaking. "For Grandma," Lena kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the scent of lavender from last night's bath. "Grandma and I need to do this part on our own, but thank you for offering." An hour later, Lena sat in her home office, reviewing the quarterly reports one last time. Eleanor entered quietly, dressed in a burgundy dress that Lena had bought her for Christmas, but Eleanor had never worn, claiming it was too fancy for everyday use. Her silver hair was styled elegantly, her makeup subtle but flattering. She looked beautiful, dignified, and nervous. "You look lovely," Lena said aloud, then repeated it in sign, her hands moving with increasing confidence. Thank you, Eleanor signed back. Are you sure you want to do this? I don't want to cause problems for your business. You won't cause problems, Lena assured her more confidently than she felt. And even if you did, that would be my problem to handle, not yours. What will you tell them about me? About why they've never met me before? It was the question Lena had been avoiding. She'd rehearsed different responses, kept her personal life private. Her mother preferred to stay out of the spotlight. They'd had a complicated relationship. All true, but all also carefully edited versions of the truth. I'm going to tell them you're my mother, Lena said finally, and that I haven't handled that as well as I should have. But that's changing now. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away carefully, mindful of her makeup. Thank you, she signed simply. The drive to LW Couture's headquarters in Manhattan was tense. Lena's driver navigated the morning traffic while Lena and Eleanor sat in the back, both lost in their own thoughts. Once, Eleanor reached over and squeezed Lena's hand. Lena squeezed back, grateful for the anchor. The LW Couture building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the garment district, a testament to everything Lena had built from nothing. As they entered the lobby with its soaring ceilings and designer furnishings, Lena felt the familiar sense of ownership and pride. This was her domain, her empire. And today, she was bringing her mother into it. The boardroom was on the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan. When Lena and Eleanor entered, the board members were already seated around the massive conference table, reviewing the packets Lena's assistant had prepared. They looked up as one, their expressions shifting from professional welcome to confusion when they registered Eleanor's presence. "Gentlemen, Maria," Lena greeted them, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "Thank you for being here. Before we begin the quarterly review, I'd like to introduce someone very important to me." She felt Eleanor stiffen beside her, could sense her mother's nervousness radiating like heat. Lena reached out and took Eleanor's hand, a deliberate, visible gesture of connection that made several board members' eyebrows rise. "This is my mother, Eleanor Whitmore." The silence in the room was profound. Lena watched the board members process this information, saw the questions forming behind their professional expressions. In 12 years of quarterly meetings, Lena had never once mentioned a mother. As far as they knew, she'd sprung fully formed into existence, a self-made billionaire with no family ties. Thomas Rothschild, the oldest board member and one of her earliest investors, spoke first. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Lena has accomplished extraordinary things. You must be very proud." Eleanor smiled, but before Lena could offer to translate or explain, she did something Lena didn't expect. She spoke, using her deaf voice. The voice she'd spent Lena's entire childhood trying to make as clear as possible, despite never having heard spoken language herself. "I am very proud," Eleanor said, the words slightly slurred but perfectly understandable. "She has always been extraordinary." The board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the speech pattern of someone deaf but unsure how to respond. Lena saw pity flickering across some faces, curiosity on others, and on Thomas's face, a dawning understanding. This was the moment where Lena could smooth things over, minimize Eleanor's presence, guide the meeting back to safe professional territory. Or she could choose differently. Lena's hands moved, signing as she spoke, her voice clear and confident. "My mother is deaf. She raised me as a single parent while working 2 jobs. She's the reason I know anything about fabric and design. She was a seamstress for 30 years. And she's the reason I understand hard work and sacrifice." She paused, making eye contact with each board member. "I should have introduced you to her years ago. I didn't, and that's something I'm working to correct." Maria Chen, the tech mogul, leaned forward with interest. "You know sign language?" "I do," Lena confirmed, continuing to sign as she spoke. "I learned it as a child. I stopped using it as a teenager. I'm relearning it now along with my daughters." "You're doing wonderfully," Eleanor signed, and Lena caught the gesture in her peripheral vision, felt the support behind it. "Shall we proceed with the quarterly review?" Thomas suggested gently, his tone suggesting he understood more than he was saying. "Mrs. Whitmore, please stay if you'd like." It's good to put a face to the legacy behind LW Couture. The meeting proceeded, and to Lena's surprise, it went smoothly. The board reviewed the numbers, approved the expansion into Asian markets, discussed the sustainability initiative Lena had proposed. And through it all, Eleanor sat quietly at Lena's right hand, occasionally taking notes in the small notebook she carried, her presence acknowledged but not made spectacle. During a break for coffee, Thomas approached Lena. "That took courage," he said quietly, "bringing her here, being honest about why you hadn't before." "I'm tired of hiding," Lena replied. "I'm tired of being afraid." "Good," Thomas smiled. "Fear makes us small. Your mother raised someone brilliant. That's worth celebrating, not hiding." As the meeting reconvened and wound to its conclusion, Lena felt something shift inside her. She'd done it. She'd brought Eleanor into her professional world, and the sky hadn't fallen. Her board hadn't revolted. The empire she'd built hadn't crumbled. But as they left the building and headed back to the car, Lena's phone rang. Richard's name flashed on the screen. She almost declined, but something made her answer. "What do you want, Richard?" "We need to talk about the girls." His voice was cold, businesslike. "My lawyer will be contacting yours, but I wanted to give you a heads up. I'm filing for full custody." Lena stopped walking, Eleanor nearly colliding with her. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you're creating an unstable environment for our daughters, teaching them sign language, having them spend excessive time with your deaf mother, bringing strangers, janitors, into our home to influence them. It's inappropriate and potentially damaging to their development." Rage, white-hot and pure, flooded through Lena. "That's absurd. Learning another language isn't damaging. Connecting with their grandmother isn't inappropriate." "My lawyer disagrees. We'll see you in court, Lena. I'm sure the judge will be interested to hear why you're suddenly prioritizing your mother's comfort over our daughter's normal development." He hung up before she could respond. Lena stood on the Manhattan sidewalk, the mid-morning crowds flowing around her, her world tilting on its axis once again. Eleanor touched her arm, her expression questioning. Lena's hands moved automatically, translating the bombshell that had just been dropped. "Richard is trying to take the girls. He says teaching them to sign with you is damaging them." Eleanor's face went pale. Her hands shook as she signed back. "I'll stop coming around. "No," Lena interrupted sharply. "No. This is exactly what he wants, to make me choose between my daughters and everyone else. But I'm done choosing fear. I'm done letting other people's judgment dictate my life." But even as she signed it, even as she meant it, fear clawed at her insides. What if Richard won? What if a judge decided that Lena's sudden reconnection with her mother, the sign language lessons, the changes in their family structure, constituted instability? What if choosing love meant losing her daughters? The custody battle consumed Lena's life with the ferocity of a wildfire. Within 48 hours of Richard's phone call, her attorney Jennifer Morrison had assembled a war room in Lena's home office, the walls covered with timelines, witness lists, and documentation of every interaction Lena had with her daughters for the past 3 years. "He's claiming emotional instability," Jennifer explained, spreading out Richard's filing across the desk. "Says you've undergone a dramatic personality change, made erratic decisions about the children's education, and exposed them to an inappropriate relationship with a male stranger." "Caleb isn't inappropriate," Lena shot back, her voice sharp. "He's teaching my daughters a language. That's it." "I know that. You know that. But Richard's lawyer is painting it as a single mother bringing strange men into her home while forcing the children to learn unnecessary skills to accommodate a disability." Jennifer's expression was sympathetic, but firm. "We need to be prepared for this to get ugly." Eleanor sat in the corner of the office, her hands twisted in her lap, her face drawn with guilt. She'd tried to leave that first night, had actually packed her bags and called for a car service, but Lena had stopped her, practically begging her mother to stay. Now, watching Jennifer lay out the battle plan, Eleanor signed to Lena when there was a pause. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come to the gala, if I hadn't pushed for the lessons—" "Stop," Lena interrupted, her hands moving sharply. "This isn't your fault. This is Richard being Richard, controlling, manipulative, and determined to win at any cost. He's also your children's father," Jennifer reminded her gently. And he has rights. The fact that he's exercised minimal custody for the past 2 years doesn't erase that. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks to gather evidence, prepare witnesses, and somehow convince a family court judge that teaching her daughters to communicate with their grandmother wasn't grounds for removing them from Lena's custody. 3 weeks of barely sleeping, of reviewing every choice she'd made since the gala, of second-guessing the path she'd chosen. But something had shifted in Lena since that afternoon in the garden. The fear was still there, constant, clawing, threatening to pull her under. But beneath it ran a current of certainty she hadn't felt in years. She'd made a choice. She'd chosen love over fear, connection over control. And she wasn't going to unmake that choice just because Richard had found a new way to punish her for leaving him. The triplets, mercifully, didn't know the full extent of what was happening. They knew their father wanted them to visit more often, that lawyers were involved, that Mommy was stressed. But Lena and Jennifer had agreed to keep the details vague until absolutely necessary. No child should have to know their parents were fighting over them, like assets in a merger. Instead, life in the Whitmore household continued its new rhythm. Caleb still came on Saturdays, though now he arrived with a protective detail after Jennifer insisted on enhanced security given the custody case. He took it in stride, treating the burly bodyguard following him around like an amusing quirk rather than the threat assessment it actually was. The girls' ASL was improving rapidly. Sophia had taken to studying sign language dictionaries before bed, determined to master grammar rules and sentence structure. Emma practiced in front of mirrors, perfecting her facial expressions. The raised eyebrows for questions, the head tilts for emphasis, the way signers used their whole body to communicate. Grace, quietest of the three, had developed a special bond with Eleanor, the two of them spending hours in the garden communicating about flowers and birds and the small beauties that required no words at all. "Your daughters are remarkable," Caleb told Lena one Saturday afternoon, as they watched the girls sign an elaborate story to Eleanor about a dragon who lived in their school playground. "Most kids their age take months to get this comfortable with ASL. They're practically fluent already." "They have good motivation," Lena replied, her eyes on Eleanor's face as her mother laughed at something Emma signed. That laugh, fully embodied, unself-conscious, joyful, was worth every uncomfortable moment of the past month. "So do you," Caleb observed. He'd maintained a professional distance since that first emotional afternoon, but his kindness remained constant. "You've come a long way." "Not far enough." Lena gestured to the stack of legal documents on the patio table. "Richard's lawyer is arguing that I'm destabilizing the girls' lives, that this whole thing," she waved vaguely at the signing lesson happening in front of them, "is proof I'm having some kind of breakdown." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous. Learning to communicate with family isn't instability. It's exactly the opposite. Try explaining that to a family court judge." "I will if you need me to." Caleb met her eyes steadily. "I'll testify. I'll explain exactly what I've observed. 3 children who are happier, more connected to their grandmother, developing empathy and communication skills that most adults don't have. I'll tell them about my wife, about how sign language enriched our life together, about how these girls are getting an incredible gift." Lena felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "You'd do that? Get involved in a custody case? That's messy, Caleb. It could get personal." "It's already personal," he replied simply. "You and your family have become important to me, and I don't stand by while good people get punished for doing the right thing." That conversation took place on a Saturday in early April. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Between those 2 points, Lena barely slept, surviving on coffee and sheer determination. Jennifer had assembled an impressive witness list: the triplets' teachers, the school counselor, Eleanor's longtime physician who could attest to her fitness as a grandmother, even Thomas Rothschild, who'd offered to speak to Lena's character and stability. But the wild card was the girls themselves. At 7 years old, they were young enough that the judge wouldn't formally interview them, but old enough that their wishes and well-being would carry significant weight. If they seemed distressed, confused, or negatively impacted by the changes in their lives, Richard's case would strengthen considerably. The night before the hearing, Lena sat with each daughter individually, trying to explain what was happening without terrifying them. Daddy wants you to live with him more, she told Sophia, choosing her words carefully. And the judge, that's like a very important decision maker, needs to figure out what's best for you and your sisters. Sophia processed this with her characteristic analytical approach. Does Daddy not want us to learn sign language? Daddy thinks it's not necessary. He thinks it's taking time away from other things. But we're still doing all our regular stuff, Sophia pointed out logically. We still have school and violin and writing lessons and everything. We just also have signing now. That's like saying we can't learn French because we already speak English. From the mouths of babes, Lena thought again. You're absolutely right, sweetheart. But sometimes adults disagree about what's important. Is the judge going to make us stop signing with Grandma? Sophia's face creased with worry. Because we just got good at it. And Grandma is so much happier now. She smiles all the time. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen, Lena promised, pulling her daughter close. But I need you to know that whatever happens, Daddy and I both love you very much. This isn't about you doing anything wrong. Similar conversations with Emma and Grace yielded similar reactions. Confusion about why learning to communicate was a problem, worry about Eleanor, and a fierce loyalty to their new family dynamic that made Lena's heart ache with pride and fear in equal measure. The courthouse was an imposing building in downtown Manhattan, all marble and brass and the kind of institutional gravitas designed to remind everyone that serious business happened within its walls. Lena arrived with Jennifer, Eleanor, and a portfolio of documentation thick enough to stop a bullet. Richard was already there with his lawyer, Marcus Chen, a shark in an Armani suit known for his aggressive tactics in high-net-worth custody cases. Richard looked good. He always looked good. That had been part of his appeal when they'd met at a fashion industry event 12 years ago. Tall, classically handsome, with the kind of easy confidence that came from old money and older family names. His new fiancée stood beside him, a willowy blonde named Ashley, who worked in his hedge fund and looked at Lena with the kind of pity that made her want to commit violence. Lena, Richard greeted her with cool civility. You look tired. I am tired, Richard. Preparing to defend against baseless accusations of instability is exhausting. If they're baseless, you have nothing to worry about. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm simply doing what's best for our daughters. Before Lena could respond, Jennifer touched her arm, a warning to save it for the courtroom. They filed in, taking their positions on opposite sides of the aisle, like a wedding in reverse, a marriage ending not with celebration, but with battle. Judge Patricia Holloway entered, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every custody trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. She reviewed the initial filings in silence, her reading glasses perched on her nose, while everyone waited with held breath. This is a preliminary hearing, Judge Holloway finally said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The purpose is to determine if there's sufficient cause to modify the existing custody arrangement pending a full hearing. Mr. Chen, you have the floor. Marcus Chen stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. Thank you, Your Honor. My client Richard Whitmore seeks full custody of his 3 daughters based on their mother's recent erratic behavior and poor judgment. For the next hour, Lena sat in rigid silence while Richard's lawyer painted her as unstable, impulsive, and potentially harmful to her daughter's development. He characterized the sign language lessons as an obsessive fixation, Caleb as a strange man with unclear motives, and Eleanor as a previously absent grandmother suddenly thrust into the children's lives. Ms. Whitmore has spent 12 years building a very specific image, the self-made billionaire with no family ties, no complications, Chen continued. Then suddenly, dramatically, she reverses course. She brings this hidden deaf mother into her professional life, hires a janitor to teach her children an unnecessary language, and completely restructures the girl's home environment. This isn't growth, Your Honor. This is instability masquerading as enlightenment. Lena's fingernails dug into her palms. Jennifer had warned her to stay calm, to show no reaction, but every word felt like a physical assault. She forced herself to breathe, to trust the process, to believe that truth would prevail over rhetoric. When it was Jennifer's turn, she stood with the kind of controlled fury that came from righteous indignation channeled into professional excellence. Your Honor, what Mr. Chen calls instability, I call growth. What he calls erratic, I call correcting a long-standing mistake. Mrs. Whitmore's only crime is choosing, after years of estrangement, to rebuild her relationship with her mother and teach her daughters to communicate with their grandmother. Jennifer methodically dismantled Richard's arguments. She presented documentation of the girls' academic performance, improved across the board since the sign language lessons began. She submitted statements from their teachers praising their increased empathy and communication skills. She provided Eleanor's background check, medical records, and character references establishing her as a loving, responsible grandmother. Then came the witnesses. Mrs. Patterson testified about the triplets' enthusiasm for learning, their increased confidence, their joy in being able to communicate with Eleanor. The school counselor stated that all three girls showed no signs of distress or instability. Quite the opposite. They seemed more grounded and secure than before. Thomas Rothschild spoke eloquently about Lena's professionalism, her business acumen, and his admiration for her courage in introducing Eleanor to the board. "I've known Lena Whitmore for 12 years, he said. "I've watched her build an empire, and I've never seen her make a business decision that wasn't carefully considered and strategic. The idea that she would suddenly become reckless with the most important people in her life, her children, is absurd." But it was Caleb's testimony that shifted the room's energy. He took the stand with quiet dignity, his work-worn hands clasped in his lap, and spoke about his late wife with such tenderness that several people in the courtroom wiped their eyes. "My wife died 3 years ago," Caleb said, "and one of the things that made our life together so rich was that we could communicate fully, not just through interpreters or written notes, but in her language, in the language that felt most natural to her. I learned ASL because I loved her, and that decision opened up a whole world to me." He turned slightly to address Judge Holloway directly. "When I met Eleanor Whitmore at that gala, I saw a woman who was alone in a crowded room. Not because she was deaf, being deaf doesn't make you alone, but because the people around her, including her own daughter, had decided her deafness was too inconvenient to accommodate." Lena flinched. The truth, spoken plainly, still hurt. "What I'm teaching those little girls isn't just a language," Caleb continued. "I'm teaching them that love means meeting people where they are, that family means making effort, that difference isn't something to hide or be ashamed of, it's something to celebrate and honor." He paused, his expression earnest. "Those girls aren't being damaged by learning to sign, they're being enriched. They're learning empathy and patience and how to communicate across differences. Those are skills that will serve them their entire lives, in every relationship they have. If that's instability, Your Honor, then we should all be so unstable." The courtroom was silent when Caleb finished. Even Marcus Chen seemed momentarily at a loss, shuffling his papers while clearly recalibrating his strategy. Judge Holloway called a 15-minute recess. Lena retreated to a conference room with Jennifer and Eleanor, her hands shaking from adrenaline and suppressed emotion. "He was good," Jennifer said, referring to Caleb. "Really good." Holloway was listening. "But is it enough?" Lena asked. "I don't know. Richard's lawyer made some compelling points about sudden changes in the home environment, and you have to admit, from an outsider's perspective, it does look dramatic, going from no relationship with your mother to full integration in a matter of weeks." Eleanor signed something, and Lena translated for Jennifer. "She wants to know if she should testify, if hearing from her directly would help." Jennifer considered. Holloway didn't ask for her testimony, which means she doesn't think it's necessary. "But if Eleanor wants to speak, I do," Eleanor said aloud, her deaf voice clear despite its unusual cadence. "I want to speak for my daughter and my granddaughters." When court reconvened, Jennifer requested that Eleanor be allowed to make a statement. Marcus Chen objected, but Judge Holloway allowed it with a caveat. Eleanor could speak, but she couldn't be cross-examined as she hadn't been on the witness list. Eleanor took the stand with visible nervousness. She'd dressed carefully that morning in a navy dress Lena had helped her pick out, her silver hair styled softly, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. She chose to speak aloud rather than sign, though Jennifer stood nearby ready to interpret if needed. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she began, her words careful and measured. "I am Lena's mother and the grandmother of Sophia, Emma, and Grace. I have been deaf since birth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The courtroom was perfectly silent, everyone straining to catch her words. I raised my daughter alone after my husband died. I worked hard to give her a good life, to teach her to be strong and smart and capable, and I succeeded. Lena is all of those things. Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. But I failed to protect her from the shame the world taught her about having a deaf mother. Lena's eyes filled with tears. Beside her, Jennifer placed a steady hand on her arm. When Lena was young, people were cruel, Eleanor continued. They spoke slowly to me like I was stupid. They ignored me in stores and restaurants. They looked at my daughter with pity, like having a deaf mother was a tragedy, and I could not protect her from that. I could not make the world kinder. She looked directly at Lena, and in her eyes was a lifetime of love and regret and understanding. So when Lena started to hide me, to pretend I didn't exist, I understood. I was angry and hurt, but I understood. Because I had seen what the world did to her, and I could not blame her for wanting to escape it. Eleanor turned back to Judge Holloway. For 20 years I have been invisible to my daughter, not because she stopped loving me, but because she was taught that loving me openly would cost her too much. And then something changed. What changed, Mrs. Whitmore? Judge Holloway asked gently. My granddaughters met a kind man who showed them their grandmother was worth talking to, Eleanor said simply. And my daughter remembered that I was worth more than her shame. She chose love instead of fear. That is not instability, Your Honor. That is courage. Eleanor's hands moved as she continued, signing and speaking simultaneously. Those little girls are not being harmed by learning my language. They are learning that family is worth fighting for, that love requires effort, that different is not less. These are good lessons, Your Honor. Important lessons. She took a breath, her composure wavering. If the court decides that teaching children to love their grandmother is wrong, then I will stop coming around. I will disappear again, the way I have been disappeared for 20 years. Because the most important thing is that those girls have their mother, their strong, brave, imperfect mother who is finally learning to choose love over fear. Eleanor looked at Richard for the first time. Mr. Whitmore was a good husband in many ways, but he did not understand why Lena needed to hide me. He thought she was being cruel. He did not see that she was being wounded, and now he wants to punish her for healing. Marcus Chen stood. Your Honor, this is inappropriate. Sit down, Mr. Chen, Judge Holloway said firmly. Mrs. Whitmore is answering my question. Eleanor's hands fell still. I love my daughter. I love my granddaughters. And I think they love me too, now that they can talk to me. That is all I wanted to say. She stepped down from the stand with quiet dignity, returning to sit beside Lena. Without thinking, Lena reached for her mother's hand and held it tight, not caring what anyone in the courtroom thought. Judge Holloway reviewed her notes in silence. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. This court finds no evidence of instability or endangerment, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. Ms. Whitmore has made changes to her family structure, but all evidence suggests these changes have been positive for the children's development and well-being. Learning a second language, even at age 7, is beneficial, not harmful. Developing a closer relationship with a loving grandmother is positive, not concerning. Richard's face darkened. Ashley whispered something to him that he ignored. Furthermore, Judge Holloway continued, this court finds Mr. Whitmore's timing suspicious. He has exercised minimal custody for 2 years, showing little interest in day-to-day parenting. His sudden concern about his daughter's environment appears less about their well-being and more about controlling his ex-wife's choices. Marcus Chen stood. Your Honor, your client can speak at the full custody hearing should he choose to pursue one, Judge Holloway interrupted. But I'm warning you now, Mr. Chen, you'll need substantially more evidence than my ex-wife reconnected with her mother to modify custody in this court. The existing arrangement stands. This preliminary hearing is concluded. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Lena couldn't breathe. For a moment she just sat there, Jennifer's arm around her shoulders, Eleanor squeezing her hand, the reality of what had just happened slowly penetrating the fog of fear and adrenaline she'd been living in for weeks. She'd won. Not the war. Richard could still pursue full custody, but this battle. The judge had seen through his manipulation, had recognized the changes in their lives for what they were, healing, not harm. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor pulled Lena into an embrace. "It's over," she signed when they pulled apart, her face wet with tears. "You chose us, and it didn't cost you everything. You get to keep your daughters." "I get to keep all of you," Lena signed back, including Eleanor in that statement with deliberate emphasis. Caleb approached cautiously, his expression relieved. "Congratulations. Judge Holloway made the right call." "Thank you for testifying," Lena said, switching to spoken English. "What you said about meeting people where they are, about love requiring effort, that mattered." "I just told the truth," Caleb replied. "Your family is healing. Anyone with eyes could see that." Jennifer was already on her phone, handling the media inquiries that would inevitably follow. Lena Whitmore's custody battle would be tabloid gold. But for once, Lena didn't care about image management or damage control. She cared about getting home to her daughters, about telling them the judge said they could keep learning sign language and spending time with Grandma, about telling them that choosing love had been the right choice after all. The drive back to Westchester felt different than the drive to the courthouse had that morning. Lighter. Like a weight Lena had been carrying for decades had finally been lifted. Eleanor sat beside her in the back seat, their hands clasped together, both of them exhausted and relieved and hopeful. "What happens now?" Eleanor signed during a quiet moment. Lena considered. "Now we keep doing what we've been doing, learning, growing, being a family." She paused. "And I think it's time I made some bigger changes, public changes." "Like what?" "Like making LW Couture more accessible, like creating a foundation for deaf education and awareness, like using my platform to show people that different isn't less." Lena smiled. "Like finally being proud of my mother instead of hiding her." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears again, but they were happy tears this time. "You have always made me proud," she signed. "Even when you were hiding me, even when you were ashamed, I was proud of your strength and success. But now I am proud of your courage." When they arrived home, the triplets were waiting on the front steps with Clara, practically vibrating with anxiety. They'd been told the hearing was just boring adult business, but children always knew when something important was happening. The moment Lena stepped out of the car, all three girls rushed forward, questions tumbling over each other. "What happened? Are we in trouble? Do we have to stop learning sign language? Is Daddy mad? Is Grandma leaving?" Lena knelt down, gathering all three into her arms. "Everything is fine. The judge said you're exactly where you need to be, here, with me and Grandma. And you get to keep learning sign language and doing everything we've been doing." The relief on their faces was palpable. Emma started crying, and that set off Grace, and soon all three girls were crying while Lena held them and tried not to cry herself. "I was so scared," Sophia admitted through her tears. "I didn't want to leave Grandma. We just learned how to tell her stories and jokes and everything." "You're not leaving anyone," Lena promised. "We're all staying together." Eleanor knelt beside them, adding her embrace to Lena's, and for a moment they were simply a family, complicated, imperfect, but together. The way they should have been all along. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed and Eleanor had retired to her room, Lena sat alone in her office, staring at her laptop. She'd drafted an email to her publicity team, outlining a new initiative she wanted to launch. The Whitmore Foundation for Deaf Education and Awareness. A campaign featuring her mother, her daughters, and their journey from silence to connection. It was risky. It was public. It was everything she had spent 20 years avoiding. Her finger hovered over the send button. Then she thought about Eleanor's face in the courtroom, speaking her truth despite her nervousness. About Caleb's testimony about meeting people where they are. About her daughters signing "I love you" to their grandmother with unself-conscious joy. About choosing love over fear. She hit send. The response from her team was immediate and enthusiastic. They wanted to schedule photo shoots, interviews, a launch event. Lena said yes to all of it, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. A text came through from Caleb. "Saw the news about the hearing. I'm glad it went well. If you need anything, I'm here." Lena stared at the message for a long moment. Over the past 2 months, Caleb had become an unexpected constant in their lives. Patient teacher, gentle witness to their healing, kind man who asked for nothing in return. She thought about his testimony, the way he'd defended her family to a courtroom full of strangers. The way he looked at Eleanor with respect rather than pity. The way he looked at Lena sometimes, like he saw both who she was and who she was becoming. She typed back, "Thank you for everything. You've given our family a gift I can never repay." His response came quickly. "You don't need to repay it. Watching you all heal, watching those girls light up when they sign with their grandmother, that's payment enough." Lena smiled, setting down her phone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Richard wouldn't give up easily. The press would have questions. Her company would need careful steering through this new public narrative. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Lena allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Pride in who she was, where she came from, and who she was becoming. Her mother's daughter, her children's mother. A woman learning, finally, to speak the language of love. The press release went live at 8 the following morning, time to catch the East Coast business cycle and West Coast early risers simultaneously. Within an hour, Lena's phone was flooded with notifications. News outlets requesting interviews, industry colleagues offering support or thinly veiled curiosity, and a surprising number of messages from people sharing their own stories of family estrangement and reconciliation. The headline that dominated the fashion industry news sites read, "LW Couture CEO Lana Whitmore announces new foundation, reveals decades-long estrangement from deaf mother." Lena's publicity team had crafted the statement carefully, balancing vulnerability with strength, acknowledging past mistakes while emphasizing future action. But it was the photo accompanying the release that captured attention. Lena, Eleanor, and the triplets in the garden, all of them signing family together, their faces radiant with genuine joy. "Your phone's been ringing non-stop," her assistant Maria said, appearing in Lena's office doorway with an expression caught between excitement and concern. "Vogue wants an exclusive interview. Good Morning America wants you and Eleanor to appear together, and there are about 50 requests for speaking engagements." Lena looked up from her laptop where she'd been monitoring social media reactions. "What's the general sentiment?" "Overwhelmingly positive, actually. People are calling it brave, honest, inspiring. There are some critics saying it's a publicity stunt, but they're being drowned out by supporters." Maria hesitated. "There's also a message from your ex-husband's lawyer requesting a meeting." That got Lena's attention. "What kind of meeting?" He didn't specify, just said Richard would like to discuss moving forward in a more amicable manner. Translation. Richard had seen the public response and realized his custody challenge was going to backfire spectacularly. Nothing looked worse than a wealthy man trying to take children away from a mother who was publicly championing accessibility and family connection. "Tell Marcus Chen I'll consider a meeting after the foundation launch," Lena replied. "On my terms, in my time." Over the next 6 weeks, the Whitmore household transformed into controlled chaos. The foundation launch was scheduled for mid-June, giving Lena's team just enough time to organize a proper event while riding the wave of positive publicity. Eleanor moved into the estate permanently, taking over the East Wing guest suite and filling it with her sewing machine, fabric samples, and the small altar of family photos she'd maintained for decades in her small apartment in Queens. The triplets were thriving in ways that surprised even their teachers. Sophia had started a sign language club at school, teaching other students basic ASL during lunch periods. Emma had choreographed an entire dance routine to a pop song, signing the lyrics as she moved. Grace, still the quietest of the three, had begun keeping a video diary where she signed about her day, her small hands growing more confident and expressive with each entry. And Caleb continued his Saturday lessons, though they'd evolved beyond basic instruction into something more organic, conversations in sign language about books and music and life, Eleanor telling stories about her childhood, the girls asking endless questions about deaf culture and community. Lena noticed that she looked forward to Saturdays now, not just for the lessons, but for Caleb's presence. He'd become woven into their family fabric somehow. This kind man who'd knelt beside a lonely woman at a gala and changed everything without meaning to. One Saturday afternoon in May, after the lesson had ended and the girls had scattered to play, Caleb lingered as he'd started doing recently, helping Eleanor with the dishes from the snacks they'd shared. "You don't have to do that," Lena said, watching him dry plates with the comfortable ease of someone who'd washed countless dishes in his own life. "I know," Caleb replied. "But my mother raised me to clean up after myself, and the habit stuck." Eleanor signed something to him, and he laughed, signing back. Their comfort with each other had grown over the weeks, a friendship built on shared language and mutual respect. "What did she say?" Lena asked, curious. "She said, 'I'm too polite for my own good and should accept when people try to take care of me for once.'" Caleb's smile was self-deprecating. "She might have a point." "She usually does," Lena agreed. She paused, weighing her next words carefully. "Caleb, I wanted to ask you something. The foundation launches in 3 weeks. I'd like you to be there, if you're willing. Not as an employee or even just a teacher, but as someone who's part of this story. Part of our story." Caleb set down the dish towel, his expression serious. "Lena, I'm a janitor. I work night shifts at a hotel. I'm not exactly foundation gala material. You're the man who saw my mother when I wouldn't. You're the catalyst for this entire transformation." Lena met his eyes steadily. "And you're someone I'd like there, if you're comfortable with it." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, surprise, pleasure, and a hint of vulnerability that made him look younger than his 43 years. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Eleanor, who'd been watching this exchange with the knowing expression of mothers everywhere, signed something that made Caleb blush slightly and Lena raise an eyebrow. "What did she say?" "She said it's about time I said yes to something good," Caleb translated, then added with a slightly embarrassed smile, "and that I should stop making excuses and ask you to dinner sometime." Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Did she now?" "She's very direct," Caleb said, shooting Eleanor a mock glare that she returned with an unrepentant grin. "It's one of her best qualities," Lena agreed. She took a breath, feeling like a teenager but pushing through the awkwardness anyway. "For what it's worth, I'd say yes. To dinner. If you asked." "Would Friday work?" Caleb asked, and his smile was so genuinely pleased that Lena felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Friday would work." Eleanor clapped her hands together once, signed finally, with exaggerated emphasis, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them alone with their nervous laughter and the beginning of something neither had been looking for but both seemed to need. The foundation launch took place on a perfect June evening, the kind where the sky stayed light until almost 9 and the air smelled of summer possibility. Lena had rented a gallery space in Chelsea, all white walls and soaring ceilings, transforming it into a celebration of deaf culture and accessibility. The walls featured photography by deaf artists. One corner held a performance space where ASL storytellers would share narratives throughout the evening. The catering staff included deaf servers, and every surface had both printed information and QR codes linking to ASL translations. But the centerpiece was a video installation, a 12-minute documentary following Eleanor, Lena, and the triplets through their journey from silence to connection. Lena's publicity team had worked with a deaf filmmaker to create something that was honest without being exploitative, emotional without being manipulative. It showed Eleanor at the gala, sitting alone. It showed Caleb kneeling beside her. It showed the girls' first signing lessons, their mistakes and triumphs. It showed Lena's face as she signed with her mother for the first time in 20 years. And it showed them now, a family, imperfect but whole, communicating across differences that had once seemed insurmountable. Lena stood in the gallery an hour before doors opened, watching the technical crew make final adjustments, and felt Eleanor's hand on her shoulder. "Nervous?" her mother signed. "Terrified," Lena admitted. "This is so public, so exposed, everything I spent decades avoiding." Eleanor's hands moved with gentle firmness. "But you're not the same person you were decades ago. You're not that scared teenager anymore. You're a woman who chose love over fear. That woman has nothing to be ashamed of." "I'm still ashamed of hiding you for so long." "Then let tonight be the end of shame," Eleanor signed. "Let it be the beginning of something better." The guests began arriving at 7. Lena had invited a carefully curated mix, her board members and business associates, yes, but also advocates from the deaf community, educators, families with deaf children, and journalists who'd shown genuine interest in the story rather than just sensationalism. Caleb arrived right at 7, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a suit Lena suspected he'd borrowed or bought specifically for tonight. His 13-year-old son Jacob was with him, a lanky teenager who'd inherited his father's kind eyes, and Lena learned within 5 minutes of meeting him his gift for sign language. Dad's been teaching me since I was little, Jacob explained, his hands moving as he spoke. Because of my mom. I never got to meet her, but learning ASL makes me feel closer to her somehow. Lena felt her throat tighten. I'm sure your mother would be very proud of you. Thanks, Jacob said. Then, with the blunt honesty of teenagers, Dad talks about your family a lot. He says watching you guys heal reminds him why he became a teacher in the first place, even if it's just a side thing. Just a side thing? Lena looked at Caleb. You teach more than just us? Caleb shrugged, looking embarrassed. I volunteer at a community center on Sundays. Basic ASL, classes for families. It's not a big deal. It's a very big deal, Lena corrected. She made a mental note to talk to him about funding his community work properly through the foundation, but that conversation could wait. The triplets appeared, dressed in matching emerald green dresses and vibrating with excitement. They'd been practicing for weeks for their performance tonight, a song signed in ASL, choreographed with help from Eleanor and approved by a deaf cultural consultant to ensure it was respectful rather than appropriative. Mommy, there are so many people! Emma's eyes were wide. Are they all here to see us? They're here to celebrate what we've learned, Lena corrected gently. About communication, about family, about not letting fear keep us from loving people. Sophia, ever practical, asked, What if we mess up the signs? Then you smile and keep going, Eleanor signed, kneeling down to their level. The point isn't perfection. The point is trying. As the gallery filled with guests, Lena found herself relaxing into the evening. She introduced Eleanor to everyone who approached, not as an afterthought or obligation, but with genuine pride. This is my mother, Eleanor Whitmore. She's the inspiration behind the foundation and the strongest person I know. She watched Eleanor bloom under this attention, watched her mother engage in animated sign conversations with members of the deaf community, watched her laugh and gesture, and exist fully in a space that honored rather than erased her. Thomas Rothschild approached with a woman Lena didn't recognize. Lena, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Chen. She runs a nonprofit focused on accessibility in corporate spaces. I thought you two should connect. The conversation that followed led to a partnership discussion, which led to an invitation to speak at a conference, which led to 3 more introductions. By 8 o'clock, Lena's head was spinning with possibilities, not just for the foundation, but for making LW Couture a leader in accessibility across the fashion industry. At 8:30, the performances began. ASL storytellers captivated the crowd with narratives that needed no sound, their hands and faces painting pictures more vivid than words. A deaf musician performed, the vibrations of her bass guitar carrying through the floor while her lyrics were projected in both English and ASL. And then it was time for the triplets. Lena's heart hammered as her daughters took the small performance space, 3 identical figures in green dresses, their faces nervous but determined. Eleanor stood beside Lena, her hand gripping her daughters tightly. Caleb and Jacob had moved closer, offering silent support. The music started, a gentle, melodic song about belonging and home, and the girls began to sign. Their hands moved in unison, 3 sets of small fingers forming shapes that told a story about finding your way back to family, about learning to speak in new languages, about love that waits patiently for fear to subside. They weren't perfect. Emma's timing was slightly off in the second verse. Sophia's expression was a bit too serious for the joyful chorus. Grace hesitated for a half-second before the bridge, but they were beautiful. They were trying. And they were doing it all for their grandmother, who stood watching with tears streaming down her face. When the song ended, the gallery erupted in applause, not just polite charity event clapping, but genuine enthusiastic appreciation. People stood, they cheered, and Eleanor, who couldn't hear any of it, felt it in the vibrations through the floor, saw it in the sea of hands waving in the ASL sign for applause. The triplets ran to Eleanor first, not to Lena, throwing their arms around their grandmother while signing, "Did we do good? Did you like it? Were you proud?" Eleanor pulled them close, her hands moving over their heads, their shoulders, their faces, as if she needed to physically confirm they were real. "You were perfect," she signed when she finally had enough composure. "You were absolutely perfect." Lena watched this reunion with a full heart, and felt Caleb's hand briefly touch her shoulder, a gesture of congratulation and understanding and something more that they were both still figuring out. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and commitments. The foundation secured 3 major corporate sponsors. 5 families approached Lena with stories about their own deaf family members and struggles with accessibility. 2 journalists asked for in-depth interviews. But the moment that stuck with Lena came near the end of the night, when a young woman approached Eleanor hesitantly. She was perhaps 25, with an anxious expression and hands that kept starting to sign before stopping. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she said aloud, her voice carrying the same cadence as Eleanor's. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I had to say something." Eleanor smiled encouragingly, waiting. "I'm deaf too," the young woman continued, switching to sign now. "And I saw your daughter's interview in Fashion Week Daily, where she talked about being ashamed of you when she was younger, about hiding you from her life." Lena tensed, preparing to intervene if this became confrontational, but Eleanor simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. "My daughter is 15, the young woman signed, "and for the past year she's been doing the same thing, pulling away from me, refusing to sign with me in public, acting like I embarrass her." Eleanor's expression softened with understanding. "But then she read that interview, and she watched the video of your granddaughter's signing, and last night she came to my room and signed with me for the first time in months." The young woman's hands trembled. She apologized, she cried, and she asked me to teach her more because she realized she'd been letting fear make her cruel. Eleanor reached out and took the young woman's hands in hers. "Children need time to learn what matters," she signed. "Sometimes they need to see other people choosing love before they can choose it themselves." "Thank you," the young woman signed, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for being brave enough to share your story. You saved my relationship with my daughter." After she left, Eleanor stood very still, processing what had just happened. Then she turned to Lena, her eyes bright with tears and something that looked like wonder. "Do you see what you did?" she signed. "By being honest about our pain, you helped someone else heal theirs. Your shame became their salvation." Lena hadn't thought of it that way. She'd been so focused on her own journey, her own healing, that she hadn't considered how her story might ripple outward. "I just told the truth." "The truth is powerful," Eleanor signed. "More powerful than perfection ever was." The gallery slowly emptied, guests departing with programs and promises to stay involved with the foundation's work. The triplets had long since been taken home by Clara, exhausted from excitement and past their bedtime. The catering staff packed up the last of the food, moving efficiently through the space. Lena found herself standing in front of the video installation with Eleanor, Caleb, and Jacob, the 4 of them watching the 12-minute loop play one more time. There was Eleanor at the gala, alone in the corner. There was Caleb kneeling beside her, his hands forming the first signs. There were the triplets learning, stumbling, succeeding. There was Lena, signing with her mother in the garden, both of them crying. "It's a good story," Jacob observed. "It has a happy ending." "It's not an ending," Caleb corrected gently. "It's a beginning. Right, Lena?" "Right," Lena agreed. She looked at Eleanor, this woman who'd waited decades for her daughter to see her, to choose her, to love her openly. "It's a beginning." 2 weeks later, Richard's lawyer called to schedule that meeting. They met in a neutral conference room, Richard and Marcus Chen on one side of the table, Lena and Jennifer on the other. Richard looked tired, older than his 42 years, and distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm withdrawing the custody petition," he said without preamble. "My lawyer advised me it was unwinnable, and after seeing the foundation launch coverage, I agree." Lena waited, sensing there was more. "I was angry," Richard continued, his voice carefully controlled. "When you left. When you built this empire without me. When you seemed to move on so easily. I wanted to hurt you. Taking the girls seemed like the way to do that." "That's honest, at least," Lena said coolly. "I was wrong," Richard said, and he actually seemed to mean it. "Watching that video, seeing how happy the girls are, seeing you with your mother, I realized I was trying to punish you for becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who wasn't ashamed anymore." "So you'll leave the custody arrangement alone?" "I'll leave it alone. I'd actually like to renegotiate to less time, not more. Ashley and I are planning our wedding, and honestly, the girls seem more stable with you and Eleanor than they ever are with me. It was possibly the most honest Richard had been with her since their divorce. Lena glanced at Jennifer, who gave a small nod. They'd take the win. I'd like them to know their grandmother better too, Richard added. When they're with me, if Eleanor is willing, I'd like to learn some sign language so I can communicate with her at school events and holidays. That surprised Lena more than the custody withdrawal. You want to learn ASL? Sophia informed me that only ignorant people refuse to learn how to talk to their family, Richard said with a rueful smile. She has your bluntness. She has Eleanor's wisdom, Lena corrected, but she was smiling too, just a little. I'll ask my mother. If she's willing to teach you, I won't object. They spent another hour working out the details with their lawyers, but the fight had gone out of the process. By the time Lena left the conference room, she felt lighter than she had in months. She called Eleanor from the car. Richard wants to learn sign language, she said when her mother answered the video phone. Can you believe it? Eleanor's laugh was visible in the shake of her shoulders. People surprise you, she signed. Sometimes they grow up, even when you've stopped expecting it. Will you teach him? I'll teach anyone who wants to learn, Eleanor replied. That's what the foundation is for, isn't it? Opening doors that fear has closed. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made New York shimmer like a mirage. The foundation's work expanded rapidly, partnerships with schools, corporate training programs, scholarships for deaf students pursuing fashion and design. Lena found herself speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, becoming a voice for accessibility in ways that both terrified and energized her. The triplets spent their summer break signing constantly, with Eleanor, with Caleb and Jacob, who visited most weekends now, with each other in their own private language that blended ASL with childhood invention. They dragged their summer camp counselors through basic sign language tutorials and insisted on captioning their backyard theatrical productions. And Lena, who'd spent so many years hiding and controlling and maintaining perfect facades, learned to live more openly. Not perfectly. She still had moments of fear, still caught herself calculating how things would look to others, still struggled with the vulnerability that honesty required. But she was trying. And trying, as Eleanor had told the triplets, was what mattered. Her relationship with Caleb evolved slowly, carefully, both of them wary of moving too fast or disrupting the delicate balance they'd found. They had dinner most Friday nights, sometimes with Jacob, sometimes without. They talked about his late wife and Lena's failed marriage, about raising children alone, about the fear of starting over. I never thought I'd find someone I could love again, Caleb admitted one evening as they walked through Central Park, the August heat finally breaking into something breathable. After Maria died, I convinced myself that was it. One great love per lifetime. What changed? Lena asked. I watched you choose courage over comfort, Caleb said simply. I watched you rebuild your relationship with your mother even when it was terrifying. And I thought, if she can be that brave, maybe I can be brave too. Lena stopped walking, turning to face him on the path. Around them the city hummed with life, joggers and cyclists and families enjoying the evening. What does brave look like for you? This, Caleb said, and kissed her gently, his hand cupping her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Choosing to try again. Choosing to believe that good things can happen twice. Lena kissed him back, tasting possibility and hope, and the sweet fear of wanting something you might actually get to keep. When they finally pulled apart, she said, the girls are going to be impossible about this. Emma's been asking when you're going to be her real dad for weeks. And what do you tell her? That adult relationships are complicated and require time and patience. Lena smiled. She told me that sounded like an excuse. Smart kid, Caleb laughed. Must get it from her mother. By September, when the triplets started third grade, the Whitmore household had settled into its new normal. Eleanor lived in the East Wing permanently, her sewing room a creative haven where she designed adaptive clothing for the foundation to distribute. Caleb and Jacob visited every weekend without fail. The 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys, counting Jacob and the golden retriever. Creating the kind of beautiful chaos that Lena had never imagined wanting, but now couldn't imagine living without. The final legal hearing with Richard happened on a crisp October morning. He'd filed for modified custody as promised, less time, not more, acknowledging that the girls thrived in Lena's care. Judge Holloway approved the new arrangement with barely a comment, clearly relieved to see a divorced couple acting like adults. As they left the courthouse, Richard stopped Lena on the steps. "I started ASL classes," he said. "Eleanor agreed to tutor me once a month. I'm terrible at it, but the girls seem pleased." "They are," Lena confirmed. "Sophia said you signed good morning to her last weekend." "I also accidentally told her I wanted to eat her shoes, but we're working on it." Richard's smile was self-deprecating. "Thank you, by the way, for not making this uglier than it needed to be." "Thank you for backing down," Lena replied. "The girls need both their parents, even if those parents are better apart than together." They parted on terms that weren't quite friendly, but were no longer hostile. A détente born of mutual recognition that they'd both grown past who they'd been when they married. The Foundation's first annual gala took place in November, exactly 1 year after that first charity event where everything had changed. Lena stood in the same grand celestial ballroom, but this time Eleanor sat at the main table beside her, Caleb on her other side. The Triplets honorary junior ambassadors for the foundation they'd helped inspire. The event raised over $5 million for deaf education and accessibility initiatives. But more importantly, it created space for a community to gather and celebrate. Deaf and hearing people communicating across differences, sharing stories, building connections. During her speech, Lena looked out over the crowd and saw the young woman from the launch event, her teenage daughter beside her, both of them signing enthusiastically. She saw Thomas Rothschild sitting with Dr. Chen deep in conversation about corporate accessibility. She saw Richard in the back practicing signs with Marcus Chen's wife, who was deaf and had offered to help him improve. "A year ago, I stood in this room and pretended my mother didn't exist," Lena said, her hands moving in sign language as she spoke. The ASL interpreter beside her translating her signs into spoken English for those who needed it. "I stood here surrounded by wealth and power and influence, and I was completely alone. Because I'd traded connection for control, love for image, truth for carefully constructed lies." She paused, finding Eleanor in the crowd. Her mother's face was radiant, proud, fully present. "One man changed everything," Lena continued. "A janitor who saw my mother sitting alone and made a choice. To kneel down, to communicate, to treat her with the dignity she deserved. Caleb Moore reminded me that love isn't convenient. It's not easy, but it's always worth the effort." Caleb ducked his head, embarrassed by the attention, but Jacob elbowed him with a grin. "This foundation exists because I finally learned what my mother knew all along, that being different isn't something to hide. It's something to honor, and that the only real failure is choosing fear when you could choose love." The audience erupted in applause, both audible clapping and the hand-waving of ASL applause that had become familiar to Lena over the past year. She stepped back from the podium and found herself pulled into Eleanor's embrace, her mother's arms strong around her. "I'm so proud of you," Eleanor signed when they pulled apart. "Not for the foundation or the money or the recognition. I'm proud because you chose to come home." "I was always home," Lena signed back. "I just forgot how to see it." Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Lena found Caleb and Jacob on the terrace, father and son watching the city lights together. "Thank you," she said, joining them at the railing. "For everything. For seeing us when we couldn't see ourselves." "I just knelt down," Caleb said. "You did the hard part. You stood up again." Jacob looked between them with the knowing expression of teenagers everywhere. "Are you two going to keep being weird and dancing around each other, or are you going to actually admit you're in love?" "Jacob!" Caleb's face flushed. "What?" "It's obvious. Emma says you guys are totally mushy when you think the kids aren't watching." Lena laughed, surprised by her own lack of embarrassment. A year ago, the idea of her private life being observed and commented on would have horrified her. Now, with this boy who'd become part of their chaotic family, looking at her with affection and exasperation, it just felt normal. "Your son makes excellent points," she told Caleb. "He's a terror," Caleb replied, but his arm slipped around Lena's waist, pulling her close. "And he's right. I am in love with you. Have been for months. I was just waiting for the right moment to say it." "This seems pretty right," Lena said, and kissed him while Jacob made exaggerated gagging sounds, and then quietly walked back inside to give them privacy. They stood on the terrace, the November wind sharp but not yet bitter, the city spreading out before them in a carpet of light and possibility. Somewhere inside, Eleanor was telling stories to the triplets and a group of deaf children who'd attended the gala. Somewhere in Queens, a young mother and her teenage daughter were probably signing goodnight to each other, their relationship healing because someone else had been brave enough to share their broken places. Somewhere in the world, another person was choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, truth over comfortable lies. And in Lena's arms, Caleb held her like she was precious, like she was worth the effort, like loving her was the easiest choice he'd ever made. "What happens now?" he asked, echoing the question Eleanor had asked months ago in the car. Lena thought about it, about the Foundation's expanding work, about her daughters growing up bilingual and bicultural, about Eleanor's permanent place in their home and hearts, about this man who'd changed their lives by simply refusing to let someone remain invisible. "Now we keep choosing," she said, "every day, to be brave, to be honest, to show up for each other even when it's hard, to speak the language of love in all its forms." "I can do that," Caleb said, and kissed her again. Inside, the triplets had found them through the glass doors and were making kissy faces and giggling. Eleanor stood behind them, her hand over her heart, her expression so full of joy it hurt to look at directly. Lena waved at her daughters, signed "I love you" through the glass, and watched as they signed it back. 3 identical girls who would grow up knowing their grandmother, knowing sign language, knowing that different was beautiful and love was worth fighting for. The same woman who'd once sat alone in a ballroom, invisible to her own daughter, now stood surrounded by family and laughter and love. What had changed wasn't Eleanor. She'd always been worthy, always been whole. What had changed was everyone else learning to see her, learning to kneel down, learning to sign, learning to choose love over fear. And in that choice, in that moment of finally seeing what had always been there, a family had been reborn. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole in a way that perfection could never be. Because sometimes the greatest courage isn't in building empires or making millions or commanding rooms full of powerful people. Sometimes the greatest courage is simply in saying, "I was wrong, I'm sorry, I love you, teach me how to do better." And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people you've hurt will meet you where you are, extend their hands in forgiveness, and teach you that it's never too late to come home. Lena Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, daughter, mother, and finally free, stood on that terrace and knew with absolute certainty that every painful step of the journey had been worth it. Because on the other side of shame was this: love given and received freely, family claimed openly, truth spoken in hands and hearts and voices that refused to be silenced. No one was invisible anymore. And that, Lena thought as she pulled Caleb back inside to rejoin their family, was worth more than all the empires in the world.